The flower hit the floor before Margaret even had time to set down her bag. She had walked into the Heathbrook bakery at 6 in the morning, unlocked the old wooden door with the key the estate manager had pressed into her palm without ceremony the previous afternoon, and found one of the 2 remaining staff members, a young man named Colin, standing in the middle of the kitchen with an upturned sack at his feet, white flour spreading across the stone tiles like a slow, quiet tide. He was not embarrassed. He did not apologize. He looked at her with the flat, uninterested eyes of someone who had long since stopped caring whether the day went well or badly, and he said, very simply, "Bag split." Then he turned back to the counter and picked up a cloth he did not use. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the flour on the floor, then at Colin, then at the rest of the kitchen, the dull surfaces, the cold ovens, the stacked trays that had not been moved in some time, the small window above the sink through which early morning light came in gray and thin. She took a breath, set her bag on the nearest clean surface, and said, "Where are the replacement bags kept?" Colin pointed to a low cupboard near the back wall without looking at her. She found a replacement bag, brought it to the counter, and then found a dustpan and brush hanging on a hook by the door. She did not tell Colin to sweep up. She got on her knees and began doing it herself, working steadily and without comment, the brush making soft sounds against the stone. Colin watched her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he picked up the cloth from the counter and began wiping the surface beside him. It was a small thing, but she noticed it. That was how Margaret Ashford's first morning at Heathbrook Bakery began. On her knees, on a cold stone floor, sweeping up flour that was not her fault, in a kitchen that smelled of neglect, next to a young man who was one step away from not caring about anything. She had walked into the worst version of a situation she had been warned about, and her first instinct had been practical, not dramatic. That was simply how she was made. She had not planned to be there. She had not planned much of anything in the 18 months before she arrived in Heathbrook Village. Life had rearranged itself around her in ways she had not chosen and could not fully explain to anyone, including herself, and she had done what people sometimes do when the path they were on disappears. She had gone back to the last place that felt solid. For Margaret, that place was the English countryside, and more specifically, the small village where her grandmother had lived, and where she had spent every summer of her childhood, learning what it meant to make something properly. Her grandmother's name had been Dorothy. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman who believed that the quality of a loaf told you something true about the person who had made it. She had taught Margaret to bake not as a skill to be acquired, not as a career option to be considered, but as a way of paying attention to the world. You had to feel the dough to know when it was ready. You had to smell the oven to understand when the heat was right. You had to taste what you made, honestly and without excuses, and admit to yourself when something had not worked, and work out the reason why. Dorothy had a saying she repeated so often, it had become woven into Margaret's internal rhythm. The bread does not lie, neither should you. Dorothy had been gone for 4 years. Margaret had inherited, among other small things, her grandmother's recipe book, a soft-covered notebook filled with handwriting that grew more cramped as the years went on, with flower fingerprints on the corners of pages and small annotations in pencil that sometimes said things like, "Use less honey in August, the flavor is stronger then," or, "This one is always better the next day, do not rush it." Margaret had carried it with her through the city years, through the marriage and the business attempts, and the gradual, quiet unraveling of things she had believed were permanent. When everything else had been packed up or given away, or left behind in one way or another, the recipe book was still in her bag. She had arrived in Heathbrook with very little else. She had rented a small room above a hardware shop at the edge of the village, and spent the first 2 weeks walking, through the fields, along the river path, into the village proper, and back again, trying to understand what came next. She was 36 years old, and she felt both very young and very tired at the same time, which was a strange combination, and not one she found easy to explain to anyone, so she kept it to herself. The village itself was not spectacular. She had grown up hearing her grandmother describe Heathbrook with something close to affection, and the reality of it now, in the autumn, the trees along the lane beginning to turn, the cottages close together on the main street, the small shops with their hand-lettered signs, was modest and genuine, and exactly what it looked like it would be. There was a post office, a pub called the Wentmore Arms, that had a blackboard outside advertising daily meals, a small church with an old stone wall, and a yard where the headstones leaned at various angles, a school, a handful of other shops, and at the eastern end of the village, attached in a quiet way to the wider presence of the Heathbrook estate that spread beyond the last house on that side, there was the bakery. She had walked past it on her second day back, in the late afternoon, and looked in through the window. The lights were on inside and she could see a few items on the shelf behind the glass. Bread, rolls, what looked like a pastry or two, and a woman behind the counter who was not doing anything in particular at that moment, just standing. The street outside the bakery was empty. The shop itself had the particular atmosphere of somewhere that people were not currently choosing to be, which was a different thing from somewhere that was closed. She had walked on. She had not thought very much about it, at least not consciously. She had been thinking, at that moment, mostly about what her grandmother had said about the village once, that Heathbrook was the kind of place that waited for people, patiently and without judgment, and that this was a rare and undervalued quality. Dorothy had lived here for 30 years. She had known it the way you know a place you have chosen and then kept choosing, year after year, until the choosing becomes simply where you are. Margaret had not grown up here. She had grown up in the Midlands, in a small terrace house with a mother who worked long hours, and a father who was quiet, in the particular way that can go in several directions depending on the day. The summers with Dorothy had been the exception to the ordinary rhythm of her childhood, weeks of wide fields and deliberate attention, and a kitchen that always smelled of something good, and a grandmother who never made her feel like she was taking up too much space, or asking too many questions. Dorothy had always seemed genuinely pleased to see her, which was not something Margaret had experienced as a constant in most other relationships, and she had carried that warmth with her for 30 years, without quite knowing she was doing it. It was Dorothy who had first pressed flour into her hands when she was 7 years old, and told her to feel what it was, not to do anything with it yet, just feel, the cool, dry weight of it, the way it coated your skin, the fine, almost powdery quality, that was nothing like it would become once water touched it. Margaret had pressed it between her fingers, and looked up, unsure what she was supposed to be learning. "Now you know what flour is," Dorothy had said, "not from a picture, from your hands." That was the method of everything Dorothy taught, direct, physical, without shortcut, and without apology. You learned bread by making bread, again and again, through the batches that were fine and the batches that were not, until the decisions that once required concentration became instinct, and the instinct became a form of trust in your own judgment. You did not always get it right. When you did not get it right, you ate what you had made anyway, because wasting food was not something Dorothy accepted under any circumstances, and you worked out specifically what had gone wrong, and then you tried again. Margaret had made hundreds of loaves in Dorothy's kitchen over the years. She had made them as a child being carefully taught, as a teenager who occasionally thought she knew better, and was shown, gently but precisely, that she did not, as a young woman home between terms at university, as a slightly older woman who came back one summer with a new husband and a new confidence that turned out to be more borrowed than earned, and then finally as a woman coming back alone. The summer before Dorothy died, when the kitchen had seemed smaller than she remembered, and Dorothy's hands had developed a slight shake when she passed the dough across the table, but her eye had remained as precise as ever, and she could still tell, from a glance at the color, the crust, the shape of the scoring, whether a loaf was going to be right, before it had even finished cooling. On that last visit, Dorothy had taken the recipe book from the shelf one afternoon, without ceremony, and held it out. "You will get more use from this than I will," she said. Margaret had taken it and held it and not said anything for a moment, because the thing that was being said between the lines of that statement was something neither of them found easy to address directly, and Dorothy had never been the kind of person who needed things said aloud to acknowledge that they were real. She had carried the book home and put it on her shelf and tried not to read too much into it. 6 months later, Dorothy was gone, in the quiet and unsurprising way of someone who had been preparing for a thing for some time and had simply completed the preparation. The book stayed on the shelf through 2 more apartments and the slow unraveling of a marriage that had been wrong from the beginning in ways that were nobody's fault and everybody's fault at once, and then, through 1 further year of trying to build a small food business that she had believed in genuinely, and that the market had not quite believed in enough. When the lease on the business premises ended, and she stood alone in the empty space on the last day, looking at the bare shelves, she thought, I have tried several things that have not worked. I still know how to bake. She had taken the recipe book from the shelf that night and read it from the first page to the last. Then she had moved to Heathbrook. The morning she sold bread at the village market was not carefully planned. She had made 3 dozen honey rye loaves the previous night in the small kitchen of her rented room, mostly because the act of baking was one of the few things that made her feel genuinely clear-headed, and she had far more loaves than she could reasonably eat. She had boxed them up in the early morning, carried them to the market on foot in the gray autumn dawn, set them on a table borrowed from the market organizer, written a small card with the name and price of the loaf, and stood behind the table in her coat, with her hands in her pockets, not expecting very much. She had sold every single one in under an hour. Several of the people who had bought them asked where she was based, whether she had a shop. She told them she did not. Some of them looked genuinely disappointed, which surprised her more than she expected. One older woman, who had bought 2 loaves, and was pressing one of them lightly with her fingers, to test the spring of the crumb, said without looking up, "These are the best loaves I have tasted since old Dorothy used to sell at this market." Margaret looked at the woman. "You knew Dorothy Ashford?" The woman looked up then, properly, and looked at Margaret with fresh attention. "She was your grandmother?" "Yes." "Then it is in the blood," the woman said simply, and finished paying, and walked away. Margaret packed up the empty table, and walked back to her room, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She did not think the talent was in the blood. She had never believed that, or at least she had always felt that if it was in the blood, it was in the blood because Dorothy had put it there, through patience and repetition and careful attention, year after year, until it became so much a part of Margaret's understanding of how to be in the world, that it felt as natural as breathing. But the woman's words stayed with her, not for their literal meaning, but for what was underneath them. The recognition that something had been passed on, and that it was worth passing, and that here, in this village, that passing still meant something to people. 3 days after the market, Frederick Holt came to find her. He was the estate manager for Heathbrook, a precise and methodical man in his late 50s, who wore a waxed jacket in all weathers, and kept a small leather notebook in his breast pocket, which she would come to understand was the physical form of his considerable organizational mind. He knocked at the door of the hardware shop below her room, and was directed upstairs by the owner, and when she opened the door, he introduced himself with formal brevity, and said that the Duke of Wentmore had heard about the bread she had sold at the market, and would like to meet with her the following morning at the estate, if she was available. She almost said no. She was not sure why. Some combination of caution and the particular weariness of someone who had built things before and was not yet ready to begin something new, or not yet ready to admit that she was. But she looked at Frederick's careful, undemanding expression, and thought about the woman at the market, and the empty table, and the way she had felt standing behind it, and she said yes. The Heathbrook estate was not what she had imagined, though she had grown up hearing about it, and had passed the entrance gates on walks as a child. It was large in the way that very old English estates are large, not flashy, not designed to impress on first viewing, but quietly enormous in the way that accumulates over centuries. The same stone used in the same way, the same trees in the same positions, the same arrangements of field and track and boundary wall, all of it settled into the landscape so completely that it was difficult to imagine the landscape without it. The house itself was what people meant when they said impressive, and did not mean grand. It was the kind of place that made you feel, without doing anything dramatic, that it had been here for a very long time, and would go on being here for a very long time more. She was taken through the entrance to a study on the ground floor, and the Duke was already in the room when she arrived, standing at the window with his back to the door, turning when she entered. She had a moment to look at him, before either of them spoke. He was in his middle 50s, tall, with a face that was not unkind, but was very controlled, in the way of someone who had learned, or perhaps simply always known, to assess situations before committing to a response. He was dressed in plain clothes, no indication of his position, except the confidence with which he occupied the room. He held a cup of tea, that he did not set down when he greeted her. He gestured to a chair. She sat. He remained standing, which she noticed without commenting on. He told her about the bakery. He said it had been part of the Heathbrook estate for over 60 years, established originally to supply bread and baked goods to the estate workers and the surrounding village community. He said that for most of that time, it had operated at a profit and had been, in his words, a source of genuine pride for both the estate and the village. He said that in the past 2.5 years, it had declined steadily, revenue falling, quality falling, customer numbers falling, and that 3 separate managers had been brought in during that time, each of whom had lasted less than 2 months, before concluding that the situation was beyond recovery, or before the Duke had concluded that they were not the right person to do the recovering. He looked at her directly when he reached the part she had been waiting for. He said he was offering her the role of bakery manager. He gave her the details plainly: a modest salary, long hours, no renovation budget, no additional operating funds beyond what was currently available, a monthly report to Frederick, and a 6-month window in which to show clear and measurable progress. If that progress did not materialize, he would consider alternative arrangements for the bakery. He did not elaborate on what those alternatives were, which she noticed. "I want to be clear with you," he said. "I am not offering you this position because I am confident that you will succeed. I am offering it because what I heard about your bread at the market last Saturday gave me a reason to consider you where I might not have otherwise. Whether that consideration proves to have been justified remains to be seen." She sat with his words for a moment. She thought about the cold kitchen she had not yet seen properly, the 2 staff members she had not yet met, the accounts she had not yet read, the number of ways this could go wrong. She thought about all of that very clearly, and without flinching from it. Then she said, "I would like to see the bakery before I give you an answer." A brief pause. "Of course," he said. Frederick took her there that afternoon. She walked through every room, the kitchen, the front of the shop, the storage area, the small office at the back, and she looked at everything with the careful, unhurried attention that she gave to things she was assessing honestly. She checked what was in the stores. She tested the ovens by feeling the heat of them with her hand and checking the thermostat settings. She opened the flour and checked the quality by smell and by feel. She read the past week's sales ledger that Frederick handed her without comment, and she stood in the office and looked at the numbers for a long time, doing arithmetic in her head. When she came back out to the kitchen, where Frederick was waiting with his notebook open, she said, "It is fixable." He looked at her. "Others have said that." "I know," she said, "but they were wrong about how." She did not explain further, and he did not ask her to. That evening she went back to the estate and told the Duke she would take the position. He nodded as though this were simply information to be recorded. He said Frederick would handle the paperwork. He said she could begin on Monday. On the drive back to the village, sitting in the passenger seat of Frederick's old estate car, Margaret looked out at the fields going dark in the late afternoon and thought about what she had just committed to. She was not frightened. Frightened was not quite the right word for what she felt. She was very alert, the kind of alert that comes when you understand that something genuinely important is about to start and that you are the person responsible for whether it works. The recipe book was in her bag beside her. She put her hand on it briefly, feeling the soft cover through the fabric. Then she looked back at the road and let herself think about bread. She thought about what her grandmother had said once, years ago, when Margaret had been frustrated with a batch that kept going wrong in a way she could not identify. "You are fighting the bread." You cannot win a fight with bread. You have to work with what it wants to do, not what you want it to do. At the time she had thought this was slightly mystical for a practical lesson about baking. She had been 23. Now she understood that it was the most practical lesson there was. You had to start from what was actually there, not from what you wished was there, and work forward from that reality honestly. The bakery was what it was. She had looked at it without flinching. She knew what was there, and what was not there, and what would need to change. She was going to start from that. The car turned into the village lane, the hardware shop coming into view. She said goodnight to Frederick and went upstairs and made tea and opened the recipe book at the table. She did not read it for comfort. She read it for information. She turned the pages the way she always turned them, slowly, giving each one its proper attention, reading not only the recipes but the marginal notes, the small corrections, the places where Dorothy had crossed out a word and written a better one beside it. These annotations were, in many ways, the most valuable part of the book. They were the record of a mind paying attention to what it had made and being honest about what could be improved. She spent 2 hours at the table with the book and her own notebook open beside it, writing lists and planning the first 2 weeks. Not hoping, planning. Outside, Heathbrook settled into the quiet of an autumn evening. She set her alarm for 4:30. She was up before it rang. The second morning was colder than the first, and Margaret arrived at the bakery 22 minutes earlier than she had the day before. She had spent the previous evening making a list. Not an ambitious list, not a list of everything she eventually wanted to change, but a specific and ordered list of what had to happen in the first 2 weeks, simply to stop the situation from getting worse. The bakery was bleeding in several directions at once. She had seen that in the afternoon visit, read it in the accounts, felt it in the emptiness of the shelves and the listlessness of the staff. Before she could build anything, she had to stop the bleeding. That was the first job. She wrote the list in the clear, unhurried handwriting that people who knew her always noticed, and she set it on the table beside her and went to sleep thinking about the order in which things needed to happen. When she walked into the kitchen at 5:10 that morning, the kitchen was empty. Colin was not there. The other staff member, a woman named Patricia Marsh, 47 years old, who had worked at the Heathbrook Bakery for 9 consecutive years, was also not there. The ovens were cold. Nothing had been started. The trays from the previous day were stacked by the sink, still unwashed. Margaret stood in the center of the kitchen for a moment. It was completely silent, except for the sound of a slight wind at the window above the sink. She put on the apron she had brought from her room. She had not yet been given a bakery apron, which was itself a detail worth noting, and she washed her hands at the sink and dried them, and turned on the ovens to begin warming them. Then she went through the stores methodically. There was flour, enough, though not as much as she would want by the end of the week. There was butter in the cold store, less than she would have liked. There were eggs. There was no fresh yeast, but at the back of the main cupboard she found a jar of dried yeast, checked the date on the label, decided it was recent enough to work, and set it on the counter. She began. She made a standard white tin loaf dough first, the most forgiving recipe, the one least likely to go wrong while she was getting acquainted with the ovens. She worked the dough by hand because she wanted to feel how the kitchen's environment was affecting the flour, the temperature of the air, the texture of the dough at different stages, the way it responded to her pressure. Every kitchen had its own particular character. You could only learn it by working in it. By the time Colin arrived at 6:44, 44 minutes after the start time listed on the employment contract that Frederick had provided to her along with the key, she had 2 batches of white tin loaves in the oven and a tray of plain rolls proving under a cloth on the counter. The kitchen smelled, for the first time since she had set foot in it, the way a bakery was supposed to smell: yeast and warm flour, and the particular sweetness that comes when bread dough is working properly. Colin stopped in the doorway and looked at the proving tray, then at the lit oven, then at her. "You started without us," he said. There was no accusation in it. It was an observation, offered flatly. "You were not here," she said. "Put an apron on and wash your hands." He put the apron on. He washed his hands. He did not say anything else for a while, but she noticed, as the morning went on, that he moved a little more purposefully than he had the day before. Not quickly, not energetically, but without the dragging quality that had characterized his movements in the flour spill morning. A fraction more engaged. She noted it, without drawing attention to it. Patricia arrived at 7 exactly, which immediately distinguished her from Colin in one practical way. She was on time. She came through the door with the manner of someone who had done this same thing, the same arrival at the same time in the same kitchen, enough times that it had become simply a part of how the day began. She was not unfriendly. She looked at Margaret with the careful, measuring expression of someone who had been through enough changes in management to have developed a reasonable skepticism about new beginnings, and she said good morning, and she put on her apron, and she went to the sink and washed her hands, and she got to work. She was competent. That was immediately clear. The competence had an unused quality to it. The competence of someone who had been doing less than they were capable of for long enough that the gap between their ability and their output had become normal. But the capability was there. Margaret could see it in the way Patricia handled the dough when she started on the second batch, the ease and economy of her movements, the knowledge in her hands. That first full day was a long one. Margaret worked through everything on her list in the order she had planned. She served at the counter herself during the mid-morning slow period because she wanted to see who came in and what they bought and how they interacted with the space. She cleaned equipment that had been left in a state that she found unacceptable and said nothing about, because pointing out what should already be obvious was rarely the most efficient way to get it fixed. She looked at the weekly order forms from the main suppliers and made notes about what was being over-ordered and what was being under-ordered. She looked at the maintenance log for the ovens and found it had not been updated in several months. She also looked very carefully at the quality of what was currently coming out of those ovens. The bread was not terrible. That, in a way, was the most useful thing she found on that first full day. Not that the bakery was catastrophically bad, but that it was bad in a specific and identifiable way. The bread was adequate. It was competent, in the same unused way that Patricia was competent. Someone had known how to make good bread in this kitchen, and had made it here for years, and the knowledge was still present in the equipment and the recipes on file, and the hands of the person who had stayed longest. What was missing was not the knowledge. What was missing was the reason to do it well. She thought about this on the walk home that evening. The reason to do it well. That was what she needed to find and give back to this place. Not a new technique, or a better supplier, or a different schedule, though all of those things would be part of it. The thing that was actually missing was the conviction that the doing of it well mattered. That someone cared whether the loaf in the window was the best version of that loaf it could be, or just a loaf. She had that conviction. The question was whether she could give it to other people, and whether other people would want it. She went home and updated her list, and set her alarm for 4:30, and went to sleep. On the third morning, Colin arrived 5 minutes before his start time. She did not acknowledge this, but she was aware of it. She had been there since 5, already into the second batch, and when he came through the door and saw the state of the kitchen, warm, active, already in motion, she could see something shift in his expression. A recalibration. He had expected, perhaps, to find her arriving with him. Finding the kitchen already working changed something in the equation of what the morning was. By the end of the first week, he was arriving on time every day, and by the end of the second week, he was arriving a few minutes early. She had not said a word about his original lateness after the first day. She had simply been there, before him, without fail, making things. It was the most efficient communication she knew, the fact of the effort, visible every morning. The flour supplier situation required a phone call she had been preparing herself for since her first look at the accounts. Hartley & Sons was a family-run milling business based 12 miles from the village, and they had been supplying the Heathbrook Bakery for 11 years. The outstanding balance owed to them was significant. 92 days of invoices unpaid, accumulating from the period before Margaret's arrival, when the bakery's finances had been managed, by her reading of the ledgers, with a combination of optimism and avoidance. She could not simply ignore the debt and start fresh. It was real, and it was owed, and it had to be addressed. She called on a Wednesday afternoon, after the midday rush that was not yet a rush, just a slight increase in traffic around lunchtime. Graham Hartley answered. She could hear in his voice, within the first 2 sentences of her explaining who she was, that he had been waiting for this call with the particular patience of a business owner who has been waiting long enough that the patience has curdled slightly into something colder. She did not apologize for the previous management. She did not offer excuses. She told him plainly what she knew. The balance, the timeline, and the fact that she was newly in charge and intended to address it. Then she told him what she could offer. 3 equal payments across 6 weeks to clear the outstanding amount in full, and full payment on delivery for all new orders from the current date forward. "Why should I accept that?" Graham said, "instead of simply sending you to collections?" "You can do that," she said. "That is a reasonable option, and I understand it. But it means you write off several months of unpaid supply and lose an account that has been regular for 11 years. My proposal means you are paid in full, on a clear timeline, and you keep a customer who will pay promptly from this point on." A silence on the line. Not an empty silence, a thinking one. 6 weeks, he said, "and I want the first payment this week." "You will have it by Friday," she said. "Fine," he said. She wrote the agreement in her notebook immediately after the call, with the date and the terms and his name, and then she transferred it to the formal correspondence file she had already started building. Documentation was not something she treated as an afterthought. Everything that happened under her management would have a paper record, clearly maintained. Patricia was the harder conversation of the early weeks. Not because she was difficult, but because she was too professional to show what she was actually thinking. And Margaret needed to know what Patricia was actually thinking in order to understand what she was working with. She found the opportunity on the Friday afternoon of the first week, when the counter was quiet and Colin had gone to do the end-of-day cleaning in the storage area. She came out from the office with 2 cups of tea and set one on the counter beside Patricia without being asked, and they stood together for a few minutes without speaking, which was a kind of conversation in itself. 9 years, Margaret said eventually. 9 years, Patricia confirmed, looking at the street outside the window. You have seen how things used to be here. Yes. What do you remember about that? Patricia was quiet for a moment. She picked up her tea. It was busier, she said. Not just more customers. Busier in the kitchen. More going on. More different things to make. The person who ran it before used to change the range with the season. There was always something that was only available for a particular few weeks. She paused. People came in for the specific thing, not just because they needed bread. Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "What happened to that?" "The woman who used to do it retired," Patricia said. "The one after her had different ideas. Then there were the 2 managers who came and went quickly, and by the time the last one arrived, there was not much point putting in that kind of effort, because no one was sure the place was going to stay open anyway." She looked at Margaret with the calm, direct look of someone who has decided to be honest. People stop trying when they cannot see a reason to try. Margaret held her gaze. "Can you see a reason now?" Patricia looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," she said, "but I am watching." It was the most honest answer she could have given, and Margaret respected it. She did not ask for more than that. By the end of the second week, the bread coming out of the ovens was better than it had been, noticeably better. She was confident of that, though the change was subtle enough that a casual customer might not have identified it. The improvement was not in the recipes, which had not changed. It was in the execution. More careful attention to proving times, more consistent oven temperatures, fresher ingredients used in the right sequence, trays properly preheated before the dough went on. These were not complicated adjustments. They were the adjustments of people who were paying attention, which was a different thing from people who were going through the motions. Patricia had begun offering suggestions. The first one came on the Tuesday of the second week, when she stopped beside Margaret as she was pulling a tray of brown loaves from the oven, and said, without particular emphasis, "Those could go another 2 minutes." Margaret looked at the loaves. Patricia was right. "Show me what you mean," she said. And Patricia showed her. The particular shade of dark brown on the crust that indicated readiness. The tap on the bottom of the loaf that told you more than the color alone, the weight in the hand. These were things Margaret knew from Dorothy's kitchen, had learned herself years ago, but Patricia's version of them was specific to this oven in this kitchen in this village, and that specificity was worth more than any general knowledge. "Thank you," Margaret said, and she meant it plainly. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to work. The following morning, she suggested a different scoring pattern for the rolls. She was right about that too. On Thursday, she mentioned that the butter for the pastry was better taken out of cold storage slightly later in the season, to account for the drop in kitchen temperature, and she was right about that as well. Each time Margaret listened, and each time she used the suggestion, and each time she said something acknowledging that it had been correct and helpful. She did not make a ceremony of it. She just said it clearly and moved on. But she noticed that the acknowledgments were being received, and that they were changing something, very slowly, in the same way that good bread changes as it proves, invisibly, until suddenly the change is visible. By the end of the second week, Patricia was arriving 10 minutes before her start time. The accounts, after 2 weeks of careful untangling, told a story that was not encouraging, but was at least legible. Legibility was the necessary first step. You could not address a problem you could not see clearly. Now she could see it clearly. Costs that had drifted upward while revenue fell. A production schedule that wasted flour and energy by making quantities that were never sold. A pricing structure that had not been reviewed in 3 years. She made corrections where she could make them immediately and flagged the others for a conversation with Frederick. Frederick came on the Friday afternoon of the second week, as she had known he would. He came every Friday, quietly and without announcement, bought something, looked around, and left a brief note on his findings for the Duke. She had come to think of his visits as a form of honest observation, which she respected. He bought a brown loaf. He looked at the display, which was tidier and more deliberate than it had been when he first saw it. He looked at the floor, which was clean. He looked at the shelves, which were not full, but were arranged, so that what was there was presented well, rather than just placed. "How is it going?" he asked, at the counter. "It is going in the right direction," she said, slowly. He nodded, as though this was the kind of answer he had been prepared to hear. "The Duke will want to see the first monthly report in 2 weeks."
"It will be ready,"
she said. He paid for the loaf and left. She watched him go, and then turned back to the kitchen, where Colin was washing trays with the particular thoroughness that had begun to emerge in him over the past 10 days. Not dramatic thoroughness, just actual thoroughness. The real kind. The kind that comes from someone who has remembered that the thing they are doing has a standard worth meeting. She thought, it is beginning. Not yet arrived, but beginning. And beginning was the hardest part, because beginning required believing that the thing you were starting would eventually become the thing you were heading toward, even when the distance between those two things was still very large, and the evidence was still very small. She believed it. She went back to work. That evening she sat at her kitchen table and wrote the first part of the monthly report. She made it honest and specific, and neither more nor less optimistic than the facts warranted. Then she opened the recipe book and looked for a long time at the page with the sourdough recipe, the slow fermented loaf with local honey that Dorothy had developed over several years and had been particularly proud of. Margaret had been thinking about this recipe for 10 days. She had been thinking about whether now was the right time to introduce it, and whether her knowledge of the bakery's ovens was yet good enough to do it justice, and whether Patricia and Colin would be ready to support a more demanding addition to the range. She had decided. Not yet. But soon. She made a note in the margin. 2 more weeks, then start testing. She closed the book and went to bed, and in the morning she was up before the alarm. The day the anonymous complaint arrived, Margaret was elbow-deep in dough. She was working on the 4th test batch of the sourdough, Dorothy's slow-fermented loaf with the honey, and she had decided, after 3 attempts that were good but not right, that the issue was not the recipe itself, but the timing of when the honey was added. She had been thinking about it the previous evening, while walking along the river path after the bakery closed, and she had reached a conclusion that felt solid. The honey needed to go in later in the mixing process, after the gluten had had time to develop, so that it distributed more evenly through the crumb. She was testing this theory now, in the early morning, before the day's regular production began, her hands moving through the dough with the concentrated attention of someone performing a precise experiment. Frederick Holt walked in at 8:45. He did not stop at the counter. He came directly to the pass-through between the front of the shop and the kitchen and said, "Could I speak with you for a moment?" He said it in the particular tone that she had learned, over the past 3 weeks, meant something was on his mind that was not comfortable. She covered the dough with a cloth, washed her hands, and came through to the front room. She led him to the small office at the back and closed the door. He placed his notebook on the desk. "There has been a complaint submitted to the estate office," he said. "About what?" "About the management of the bakery." He looked down at the notebook and read from it in the careful way he read all formal things. "It states that you have been operating outside your authorized remit as manager, that you have made changes to supplier arrangements without proper approval from the estate, and that the quality of the bakery's output has declined since your appointment." Margaret looked at him without any change in her expression. "None of that is accurate," she said. "I know," Frederick said. She paused. "You know?" "I know what I can see, Mrs. Ashford. I have been in this bakery every Friday since you started. I was in this bakery this time last month, when the situation was considerably worse than it is now. I can read the weekly sales figures, which I receive as part of my regular reports." He closed the notebook. "I am telling you about the complaint because you need to know it exists. I am not telling you because I believe it." She absorbed this. "Who made it?" "It was submitted anonymously." "Through what process?" "The estate has a general correspondence address. Anyone can write to it." He looked at her steadily. "I would encourage you to maintain your documentation thoroughly. Everything you have decided, and why you have decided it. Keep a clear record." "I already do," she said. "Good," he said. Then, after a brief pause, "The sourdough sample you left at the office last week was received very positively. He said this in the same flat, informational tone with which he said everything, and then he stood and nodded and left. She sat in the office alone for a moment. She was not shaken. She was alert. Someone had gone to the effort of filing a formal complaint, anonymously, at a point in her management when the trajectory was clearly improving. She could think of a few possible reasons for that. None of them concerned her as much as they might have concerned someone who was less certain of what she was doing. She went back to the kitchen and lifted the cloth from the dough. It had developed well while she was away. The surface had the quality she had been looking for. The slight tension under the fingertips, the elasticity that meant the gluten had done its work. She began the next stage of the test, working methodically, keeping precise notes in the small notebook she had started keeping specifically for the sourdough development. Patricia came in at that point, arriving for the start of the main day's work, and stopped when she saw what was on the proving bench. "That is different from the others," she said, looking at the dough. "Fourth attempt," Margaret said. Patricia picked up the small notebook Margaret had left open beside the bench and read the previous 3 entries, which were brief and specific. The conditions of each batch, what had been changed, what the result had been. She read them without commenting. Then she set the notebook down and looked at the dough again. "You added the honey later," she said. "Yes, after the gluten developed." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy used to do something similar with the autumn loaves," she said. "She would hold back anything sweet until the dough was ready for it. She said you could always tell when a dough was ready, because it stopped fighting you." Margaret looked at her. "You knew Dorothy?" "I started here the year before she retired," Patricia said. She was not managing the bakery herself by then. She was just a regular customer, mostly. But she used to come in and stand at the counter and watch, and sometimes she would say something. She paused. She had a way of watching that felt like being evaluated. Not unkindly, but she noticed things. "She always did," Margaret said. Patricia nodded, and she went to begin the morning's preparations, and the conversation ended there. But something had shifted between them in the telling of it. A small connection had been established. Not personal exactly, but shared. They had both known Dorothy, which meant they both knew what a standard looked like when it was being properly met. The sourdough test batch went into the ovens at 9:15, after a long, slow second prove that Margaret watched carefully, noting the temperature of the kitchen at each stage and writing it down. She did not check on it impatiently. She let it do what it needed to do, and she got on with the rest of the morning's work. And when the timer went, she pulled the tray out and stood back. They were closer than any previous batch. The scoring had opened the way she wanted it to. The crust had color. She tapped the base of a loaf and listened to the sound of it. The hollow, resonant knock that told you the crumb was right. She cut one open and tasted it. Better. Significantly better. Not quite there. The honey was still a fraction too present in the aftertaste, which meant the fermentation time needed to extend slightly, but very close. She could feel, in the eating of it, the shape of the thing she was trying to make. She was 1 or 2 adjustments away. She made a note. Extend fermentation by 2 hours on next attempt. Honey timing is correct. Do not change. Then she set the rest of the batch aside to cool, and went back to the front of the shop, where a small queue had formed at the counter while she was in the kitchen. The queue was something she had been tracking quietly. In her first week, the mid-morning period between 8 and 10 had typically brought in between 4 and 8 customers. In the second week, it had been consistently between 10 and 12. In the third week, this week, it was regularly 15 or more. She had not advertised anything. She had not done anything visible. The change was coming from the bread itself, and from the particular mechanism by which word moved through a small community. Someone bought a loaf that was better than the loaf they had bought before, and they mentioned it to someone else, and that person came to see for themselves. George was one of those people. He was an older man, perhaps 70 or so, with white hair, and the upright bearing of someone who had spent a professional life requiring it, and he came into the bakery on Saturday mornings for his 2 rolls. He had been doing this, Patricia told her, for as long as Patricia could remember. It was one of those small weekly rituals that defined his Saturday mornings, in the way that small rituals define things for people who live alone. He did not talk much at the counter. He picked up his rolls, and paid, and left. On the 3rd Saturday of Margaret's tenure, he stopped at the door on his way out. He did not turn around. He said, addressing the door, That smells different. We have been adjusting the proving time, she said from behind the counter. He was silent for a moment, then he left. The following Saturday he bought 3 rolls instead of 2. He still did not comment directly, but buying 3 was a comment. She wrote his name in her notebook under a section she had started labeling regulars, and next to his name she wrote, "Responds to quality. Remembers what the bakery used to be, potential indicator of whether we are reaching the right level." The complaint filed at the estate was never followed up, as far as she could tell. She did not know whether this meant Frederick had effectively put it aside, or whether the Duke had read it and dismissed it, or whether the person who filed it had decided not to escalate. She kept her documentation thorough, as Frederick had advised. She had nothing to hide, and keeping a clear record of decisions and reasons was simply how she ran things anyway. What she thought about more than the complaint was the Harvest Festival. The idea had arrived in her mind at some point in the middle of the 3rd week, not as a completed plan, but as a seed of a possibility that she found herself examining from different angles over the next several days. The Heathbrook estate held a harvest festival each autumn. She had known this from childhood, remembered it as an occasion when the estate grounds opened to the public, and the village and the surrounding community gathered. It was the largest event associated with the estate. It drew people from beyond the village, and it was 5 weeks away. If the bakery had a stall at the Harvest Festival, properly stocked, with bread that was genuinely worth buying, in front of an audience that included people who had never been to the shop before. She kept examining the idea. She was not ready to propose it yet. She needed to know first whether the sourdough would be ready, whether the range was broad enough, whether Colin and Patricia were prepared for the volume and the visibility. She was assembling the necessary conditions in her head before she said anything to anyone. Meanwhile, she worked. The accounts were now maintained daily, in a clear and organized form that would be legible to anyone who looked at them. The supplier relationships were stabilized. Hartley & Sons had received the first installment payment and had acknowledged it with a brief, businesslike email that she had printed and filed. The waste from overproduction had been significantly reduced by adjusting the daily quantities. On the human side of the operation, things were moving more slowly, but they were moving. Colin had become, over the 3 weeks since her arrival, a different worker from the one who had stood over the spilled flour with a cloth he did not use. He was not transformed. He was still quieter than most, still unlikely to volunteer his thoughts unprompted, but the underlying energy had changed. He came in early. He cleaned without being asked. He paid attention to what was coming out of the ovens in a way that indicated he was now comparing the actual result against what the result should be, which was a category of attention that requires caring about the outcome. She had not had a direct conversation with him about any of this. She had not needed to. The conversation was happening in the work itself. The 5th test batch of the sourdough, on the Thursday of the 4th week, was the one she had been working toward. She had extended the fermentation by 2 hours from the 4th attempt, as her notes indicated, and she had done everything else exactly as she had done it in the 4th batch, because the only useful variable change between attempts was 1 variable at a time. She had told Colin the night before that she would be in the kitchen at 4 o'clock the following morning to start the extended fermentation, and she had said it as a piece of information, not as an instruction, and he had nodded. When she arrived at 4 in the morning, the kitchen was dark and empty. She turned the lights on and began. By 9 o'clock, the loaves were in the oven. By 10:30, they were out. She stood back from the cooling rack and looked at them without touching them yet. The color was right. The scoring was right. The cuts had opened cleanly and evenly, the way they should when the proof is long enough. The smell coming off the rack was the smell she had been looking for, the deep, slightly sour warmth of a genuine slow fermentation, underneath which was something rounded and sweet. That was the honey working as it should. She tapped the base of a loaf. The sound was exactly right. She cut it open. She let the slice cool for 2 full minutes on the board before she tasted it. Then she sat on the stool at the end of the counter and stayed there for a little while without doing anything, because the bread was what she had been reaching for. The crumb was open and soft, and had the particular texture that only a long fermentation produces. The crust had a crackle that was not aggressive but was completely satisfying, and the honey, not a flavor, exactly, more of a warmth, a resonance in the aftertaste, the way Dorothy had described it in the margin note, not taste, but feeling. That was the thing. That was what she had been trying to find. She wrapped 2 loaves in brown paper and put them aside. She left one for Frederick at the estate office that afternoon and kept one. The rest of the batch she put back to cool properly. Colin came through the kitchen at that point and stopped. He looked at the cooling rack. He looked at her. "Can I try one?" he said. "Yes," she said. He cut a slice from the loaf on the board and tasted it. He chewed it slowly, which was not how he usually ate things. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That one is different." "Yes," she said. "Better," he said, not as a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at the loaves on the rack again, with an expression that was difficult to read, but had something in it she had not seen on him before. Something that was close to investment, as if the success of the thing was connected to him in a way he had not previously permitted it to be. He went back to work, but he was moving differently. She had a meeting with Frederick that afternoon, their regular end-of-week review, and she brought the sourdough with her. Frederick received the wrapped loaf without ceremony and set it on the desk. He said, "I will try it this evening." He then opened his notebook, and they went through the week's numbers together, which told the same story the numbers had been telling for 3 weeks. Incremental improvement in revenue, incremental reduction in waste, gradual stabilization of the supplier situation. The arrow was pointing in the right direction. It was not pointing there dramatically. "The Duke will note the pace," Frederick said. "He should," Margaret said. "I would rather set a pace I can maintain than one that looks impressive and is not sustainable." Frederick considered this for a moment. "That is reasonable," he said. "The sourdough will go on sale next week," she said, "Monday." He made a note. "Any other plans I should be aware of?" She looked at him. "I am thinking about the Harvest Festival." His pen stopped moving. "In what capacity?" "A stall," she said. "The bakery's first public appearance at the estate's biggest annual event." Frederick looked at her in the careful, measuring way he had when something she said required him to assess it seriously. "That is a significant step for a bakery that is still in early recovery." "Yes," she said, "it is. The Duke will want to know your reasoning." "I know," she said. "I would like to speak with him directly. In the next week, if possible." Frederick noted it. "I will arrange it." She walked back to the bakery through the early evening, the air carrying the particular cold of early autumn that felt like the edge of something. Not winter yet, but the clear announcement that winter was coming. The trees along the lane had turned further since the week before, the golds and rusts more settled into their color. She thought about Dorothy, who had walked this same lane in different seasons for 30 years, who had known this village the way you know a place you have chosen deliberately and kept choosing, who had made bread here and sold it at the market here, and been remembered here not only by old people who recalled a particular loaf, but by the quality of the standard she had set, which had lived on in the bakery long after she stopped going. That was the standard Margaret was working toward. Not Dorothy's recipes exactly, though some of them were the best starting point available, the standard itself, the conviction that each loaf was worth making properly, that the people who bought it deserved the best version of the thing, that the doing of it well was not optional. She had 5 weeks until the Harvest Festival. She needed to use them. The sourdough sold out on the first Monday in 47 minutes. Margaret had made 6 loaves for the initial offering, a deliberately small quantity, because she wanted to control the first impression carefully. She had placed them at the front of the display, on the wooden shelf she had cleaned and relined with fresh paper, with a small handwritten card beside them that described the bread simply: Heathbrook sourdough, slow fermented, local honey, nothing further. She did not believe in over-explaining a good loaf. Either the smell when someone walked through the door told them what they needed to know, or it did not. On that first Monday, it told them. By 9 in the morning the bread was gone. 2 of the 6 loaves went to people she recognized as regulars. One of them was the older woman from the market who had commented on the honey rye, who had apparently been coming into the bakery on and off since Margaret arrived, and who, on this particular Monday, stopped in the doorway when she saw the display and said, "That one is new." She bought 2 loaves without asking the price first, which was, Margaret had learned, the highest signal of confidence a customer could offer. The next morning, Margaret made 8 loaves. They were gone by 10. The morning after, she made 10. They were gone before 11. By the end of the first week of the sourdough's existence on the shelves, she had a clear picture of what it could do for the bakery, not just in revenue, which had gone up noticeably, but in the nature of the traffic. People were coming in specifically for the sourdough. They were coming in on days they had not previously come in. 2 women came in on a Wednesday, and were disappointed to find the last loaf had sold 90 minutes earlier. One of them asked what time the sourdough was usually gone by, and Margaret told her, and the woman said she would set a reminder on her phone. This was not a small thing. A person setting a reminder to come to your bakery before a specific time was a person who had integrated you into their weekly life. She called the meeting with the Duke. Frederick had arranged it for the Thursday of the week after the sourdough launched, which gave her 5 days to prepare. She spent those 5 days not rehearsing what she would say, but working through the question of whether she was right about the timing. This was the more important exercise. She already knew what she wanted to say. What she needed to be certain of was whether she had sufficient grounds to believe it. She believed the Harvest Festival stall was the right move. She believed it because the sourdough had demonstrated something she had suspected but not yet proven, that the village had an appetite for quality that was not currently being met anywhere, and that when something genuinely good became available, the response was immediate and disproportionate to the advertising. People had come in based on nothing but word of mouth from other people, which was the most reliable indicator she knew of a product that was doing its actual job. She believed the stall was right, because the festival was the point of maximum visibility for the estate and the village together, and visibility at the right moment, with the right product, was an opportunity that did not repeat itself. If the bakery showed up at the festival with bread that was worth queuing for, the number of people who would walk through the bakery door in the months afterward would be substantially larger than the number who would walk through it, based on the current rate of organic growth alone. She also believed it was right because of something less precise and more difficult to argue, which was a feeling about timing, the sense that the bakery and the team, and she herself, were at a particular point in a particular arc, and that this particular point was the right one to make a larger move. She had felt this feeling before in her working life, and she had learned to take it seriously, because it was not hope or enthusiasm, both of which she was moderately suspicious of. It was assessment. It was the feeling of all the variables being aligned. She went to the estate on Thursday afternoon and met the Duke in the larger room that Frederick used for more formal meetings. She told him plainly. She wanted a stall at the Harvest Festival. She told him the numbers from the sourdough launch and what those numbers represented in terms of latent demand. She told him what a festival stall would require in terms of production and staffing, and what she believed it would produce in terms of revenue and new customer relationships. She told him it would be a statement about what the bakery had become, and a commitment to what it intended to remain. She spoke for approximately 8 minutes. She did not use notes. She was not performing conviction. She simply had it, and it came through in the clarity of what she said. When she finished, the Duke sat with the information for a moment. "If the stall does not return a profit on the day of the festival," he said, "I will need to reconsider the current arrangement." "I understand that," she said. "I do not say this to threaten you," he said. "I say it because you are proposing a significant step for a bakery that is 4 weeks into its recovery, and I need you to understand that the stakes attached to a public-facing failure at this scale are not trivial." "I understand the stakes," she said. "I would not have proposed it if I did not believe we were ready." He looked at her for a long moment. The quality of his attention was one of the things she had come to recognize about him. He listened to things fully before responding to them, which was rarer than it should have been in people with authority. "You have permission," he said. On the walk back to the village, she allowed herself, for approximately 30 seconds, to feel the weight of what she had just committed to. Then she set it aside and began thinking about what needed to happen in the 4 weeks remaining. The preparation for the festival was the most demanding period of her time at the bakery so far. She planned the range for the festival stall, the sourdough, the honey rye, the brown tin loaves, the rolls, the new morning pastry that Patricia had helped her refine over 2 sessions the previous week, and the one she had been working toward the longest, the spiced fruit loaf. She had not yet perfected the spiced fruit loaf. She had made 4 test batches, none of which had been quite right. She had maybe 3 more attempts before the festival to find the right version. She also planned the logistics, which in a small bakery with 3 people were considerably more complicated than an outside observer might suppose. Everything for the festival stall had to be made in addition to the bakery's regular production. The festival was on a Saturday. Saturday was already the busiest day of the shop week. This meant that the festival baking would have to be done in the hours before the regular Saturday production, which meant an extremely early start, earlier than her normal 4:30 alarm, significantly earlier. She put this to Colin and Patricia on a Monday morning, after the previous week's production had been cleaned up, and they had a few minutes before the lunchtime service began. She told them plainly what the festival stall would require, including the hours, including the Saturday morning start time she was envisioning, including the fact that it would be the most visible thing the bakery had done in several years, and that she believed it was worth doing. She watched their faces while she spoke. Patricia said nothing immediately. Her expression was measured and careful, the way it always was when she was assessing something significant. Colin looked at the counter for a moment. Then he said, "What time on Saturday morning?" 3, she said. He nodded. "Right," he said, and that was all. Patricia said, "What is the full range for the stall?" Margaret told her. Patricia nodded slowly. "The pastries will need to be made the day before," she said. "Not the morning of. They will be better made Friday and stored properly overnight." "You are right," Margaret said. "I was thinking the same." Patricia looked at her. "And the spiced fruit loaf, have you got it yet?" "Not quite. I have 3 more attempts before the festival." "Tell me what is missing," Patricia said. They stood in the kitchen for 40 minutes after that, going through what Margaret had tried and what had been wrong with each attempt, with Patricia listening carefully and occasionally asking a precise question. At the end of it, Patricia said, "The spice is right in the blend, but wrong in the sequence. Add the clove last, not first. The clove burns too easily. It should go in at the end, when the other spices have already opened." Margaret made the adjustment that afternoon. The batch she made on Thursday was the best she had done. She cut it open and smelled it, and the balance was right. Warm and layered, the individual spices present but not competing, the fruit sitting inside the crumb the way it should. She tasted it. She went to find Patricia. "Try this," she said, holding out a slice. Patricia took it and ate it, and looked at the floor for a moment. "That is the one," she said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Thank you." Patricia went back to the counter without another word. But the next morning she arrived 12 minutes early, which was not something she had done since Margaret arrived. The preparation in the 2 weeks before the festival accelerated. Margaret hired a young woman named Lucy Hartwell from the next village over, who had done a catering course and answered the card in the post office window, and who turned out, at interview, to have the specific qualities Margaret needed. She was honest about what she did not know. She was willing to be shown things, and she asked good questions, rather than pretending to understand when she did not. Lucy joined for a trial period of 3 weeks, with a view to becoming permanent if things went as Margaret hoped. The 4 of them, Margaret, Colin, Patricia, Lucy, spent the week before the festival in a sustained effort that was the closest thing to genuine teamwork the bakery had seen in a long time. There were moments of difficulty, particularly around the logistics of the early Saturday start, which needed to be planned in exact detail to avoid everyone tripping over each other in a kitchen that was not large. There were moments when things went wrong and had to be redone, including one evening when a batch of pastry was lost to a cooling rack that turned out to have a slight lean on one side, and Margaret had to make the decision to stay 2 hours past her planned finish time to redo them from scratch. She stayed. So did Colin, without being asked. On the Friday evening before the festival, Margaret stayed at the bakery until 9 o'clock, going through the plan for the following morning, step by step, checking the inventory, making sure everything that needed to be made ahead had been made ahead and was properly stored. She walked through the order of operations 4 times in her head until she could do it without thinking. Then she went home and set her alarm for 2:15 in the morning. The Harvest Festival day was cold and bright, the kind of autumn day that felt deliberate, a Saturday that had decided to be exactly what a Harvest Festival Saturday should be, with a sky of particular clear blue and sunlight that was warm on your face when you stood in it, and cool the moment you stepped into shade. The estate grounds opened at 10 o'clock. Margaret and her team had been set up and ready since 8:30. Their table was positioned at the entrance to the main field, which was not the position she had specifically requested, but which Frederick had allocated without explanation, and which she had come to think was probably the best possible position. It meant that anyone entering the festival grounds walked past the bakery stall first, before they had spent any money, when they were still forming their first impressions of the day. The bread was arranged on the table, with the care she gave to the shop display, the sourdoughs at the front, the honey rye beside them, the rolls grouped in clear paper bags, the pastries on a separate section of the table with a cloth underneath them, the spiced fruit loaves at the back, where the smell of them would do the work. Colin had set up a small side table to the left, with a piece of working dough on a board, and a simple card that said, "Ask us how it is made." At 10:30, the first person approached the stall. She was a woman in her 50s, with a wicker basket over one arm, and the manner of someone who had been to many such festivals, and had a clear idea of what she was looking for. She looked at the bread on the table without rushing, picked up a sourdough, pressed it gently, put it down, picked it up again, and bought it. Then she stopped and said, "Are you the people from the village bakery?" "Yes," Margaret said. "My neighbor told me to come straight here first," she said. She looked at the table again. "I can see why." She bought a spiced fruit loaf and a bag of rolls and moved on. By 11 o'clock there was a queue of 8 people. By noon, the queue had 15 people and was not getting shorter. Colin was at his side table, with 5 children around him, all watching his hands working the dough, one of them asking whether the bread was alive because it moved if you pressed it. He was explaining, with a patience that she had not seen in him before in that quantity, that yes, in a sense the bread was alive, because the yeast inside it was alive, and was doing work. The child pressed the dough again, experimentally. Lucy managed the money with concentration and accuracy. Patricia sliced the spiced fruit loaf for people who asked for half rather than a whole, which they had agreed to offer as an option, and which turned out to be popular. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Margaret sold the last item on the table. She stood behind the empty surface in the afternoon light and looked at the counting Patricia had kept in the small notebook, every sale recorded by type and price, the way they had agreed. She looked at the total. In 6 hours, they had made more money than the bakery had made in the previous 2 weeks combined. She looked up at the sky. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, quietly, to whoever was listening, "Well." Colin was packing the side table. Lucy was folding the cloths. Patricia was doing the same thing she always did, which was looking at what needed doing next and doing it. Margaret picked up a cloth and joined them. She had proposed this step, convinced the Duke, prepared for it for 4 weeks, and executed it in a single morning. She had been right. The festival had worked. The bakery had made its statement. And she had learned, in the doing of it, something she had suspected, but not yet proven in quite this form. That the 4 of them, working together with a shared understanding of what they were making and why, were capable of producing something that was genuinely worth queuing for. That was not a given. That was not something you could assume just because the ingredients were right. That was the result of specific, deliberate, patient work by specific people who had chosen, each in their own way and their own time, to care about the outcome. That evening she sat at her kitchen table and wrote the monthly report. It was the clearest and most specific report she had written yet. She ended it with one sentence. "The festival has confirmed what the past 6 weeks have suggested. The bakery is not only recovering, it is finding something new." She put the report in an envelope for Frederick. Then she opened the recipe book. She was thinking about December. She was thinking about what the bakery could become in the 6 months after the festival. She was thinking about the spiced fruit loaf and whether it should become a year-round offering or remain seasonal. She was thinking about the opening hours that Harriet from the post office had mentioned and whether the new staffing level, with Lucy now in place, made extending them possible. She was thinking about what came next. She turned to a new page in her notebook, the one she had labeled Next, and she began to write. The plan for December involved 6 new items. She had not decided on all of them yet, but she knew the shape of what she was looking for, things that were specific to the season, that made sense in the particular context of the village and the estate and the approach to the year's end, that were made from the best available ingredients and made them honestly. She was thinking about a proper enriched loaf, the kind with eggs and butter that had a different crumb from a standard tin loaf, a crumb that was tender and kept longer and was the right thing to slice thickly on a cold morning. She was thinking about a simple shortcake biscuit, the kind that Patricia had mentioned the bakery used to make before the range contracted. She was thinking about one more thing, seasonal and specific, that she had not yet defined clearly, but could feel was there, waiting for her to find it. She would find it. She always found these things when she gave them enough quiet attention. She set the notebook aside, turned off the kitchen light, and looked out the window at the village lane, which was dark and quiet and entirely still. A cat crossed the road at the far end and disappeared into a garden. A light in an upstairs window went out. She thought about what the woman at the market had said, all those weeks ago. It is in the blood. She still did not think it was in the blood, in the way the woman had meant it. But she thought she understood better now what the woman was pointing at. Not a genetic fact, but a particular transmission. Something that passed between people who paid attention to each other, who cared about the same standard, who shared a understanding of what making something well actually required. Dorothy had given that to her, year after year, summer after summer, in a kitchen that was now someone else's kitchen, in a village that was now her own. And she was, in the daily work of the bakery, giving something similar to Colin and Patricia, and now Lucy. Not a set of techniques, but a standard, a conviction, a way of understanding what the work was actually for. That was, she thought, the thing she had needed to remember when she arrived, and the thing the bakery had needed to remember too. You could always tell when a thing had forgotten what it was for. She went to bed with the window slightly open, the autumn air coming in cold and clean, and she was asleep before she had time to think any further thoughts about December. In the morning, the alarm went at 4:30, and she was dressed and walking to the bakery before 4:45, past the dark windows of the village lane, in the company of the particular silence that belongs to the time before anyone else is awake, which she had come to regard as one of the small and genuine pleasures of the life she was now living. The people came back. This was what she had hoped for, what she had worked toward, and what she had not been entirely certain would happen until it did. The people who had come to the festival stall, the ones who had queued in the bright autumn cold, who had watched Colin's hands in the dough, who had carried a Heathbrook loaf home in the crook of their arm, they came back to the bakery. Not all of them. You could not expect all of them, but enough. The Monday after the festival was the busiest weekday the Heathbrook bakery had seen since Margaret arrived. The sourdough sold out before 10:30, and she put a small card on the empty shelf that said, "More tomorrow morning." People looked at the card, nodded, and some of them bought something else, and some of them did not. But in either case, they said they would be back. Two of them mentioned hearing about the bakery from someone at the festival, who had described the sourdough as the best bread they had eaten outside of a city. This was the particular shape that word of mouth took in a small village. Specific, personal, slightly astonishing in its speed. Margaret stood at the counter on that Monday and watched the street outside fill with people walking toward the bakery, with the deliberate purpose of people going somewhere they had decided they wanted to be, and she felt a particular quality of quiet in her chest. The quiet of something working, as it was designed to work. The quiet of a bet that had paid off. She did not allow herself to rest in this feeling for long. She understood from experience that this was the precise moment at which things became most dangerous. When success had arrived enough to feel real, but not enough to be stable. When the natural response was to relax into it, when what was actually required was to hold the standard more firmly than ever. This was when the quality could slip, imperceptibly, because the pressure had eased. She had seen this happen before, in other contexts, and she was not going to let it happen here. She called a meeting of the four of them the following Wednesday afternoon, the first quiet afternoon they had had since the festival. She stood in the kitchen with Colin and Patricia and Lucy, and she said what she had observed about the increase in traffic and what she believed it represented. She said that the festival had given people a reason to come back, but that reason would only hold if what they came back to was as good as what they had tasted at the stall. She said that the standard they had hit on the festival day had to become the standard of every ordinary day, because one exceptional performance, followed by a return to adequate, was not a bakery people would continue to choose when they had other options for their bread. Colin was listening in his particular way, looking at the floor near his feet, which was how he looked when he was paying complete attention. Patricia was looking at her directly. Lucy was writing something in the small notebook she had started keeping, which Margaret had noticed and approved of without commenting on. "I want to be clear about something," Margaret said. "What we did at the festival was not a one-off. It was not a special occasion version of ourselves. It was us, at the level we are actually capable of working at. And that is the level I want us to operate at every day. Not approximately, every day. Silence for a moment. Then Patricia said, "The opening hours need to change." Margaret looked at her. "Tell me." "We are still closing at 1 o'clock on weekdays," Patricia said. "Half the people who came to the festival don't come into the village in the morning. They work. They come in after 4. We are closing before they can get here." "Harriet from the post office said the same thing," Margaret said. "Harriet is right," Patricia said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had been thinking about this for some time and had been waiting for the right moment to say it. Margaret looked at Lucy. "We have the staffing now to extend the hours." "I can do afternoon shifts," Lucy said immediately. "I prefer them, actually." She looked at Colin. "I can stay until 4 if you need it," he said, still looking at the floor. "On the days you don't have enough people." She had not expected that. She had been prepared for Colin to be neutral about it, neither for nor against, the way he had been about most things when she arrived. This was something different. This was investment. "Thank you," she said. "We will trial 4 o'clock closing from next Monday." They extended the hours the following week. She put a handwritten card in the window, as she always did with changes, because she believed that handwritten signs communicated something that printed ones did not. The fact that a person had chosen to write this for these particular people, in this place, which was different from a sign that had been printed elsewhere and attached as an afterthought. Harriet from the post office came in on the first afternoon the new hours were in effect, at 4:20, and bought a sourdough. She did not specifically comment on the new hours. She just bought the loaf and said, when she got to the counter, "I saw the card in the window," in the tone of someone acknowledging a thing they had been waiting for. Then she left. Margaret counted this as high praise. The first wholesale conversation happened because of Philip. Philip Renner ran the Wentmore Arms, the pub at the end of the village lane, and he was a person of abundant goodwill and reliable opinions, who had been buying the occasional loaf from the bakery as a personal customer for the past 3 weeks, and mentioning it to everyone who came in for a meal, which he did not, because Margaret had asked him to, but because he was simply the kind of person who told people about things he liked. 2 of the festival customers had mentioned to her, at different points, that they had first heard about the bakery from Philip, which gave her a clear picture of his reach. She went to see him on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when both the bakery and the pub were in their respective quiet periods. Philip was exactly as she had anticipated from his manner at the counter, broad, comfortable, decisive in a warm way, the kind of man who had run a pub for long enough that he could read the purpose of a visit in the first 30 seconds and meet you there. "You want to do business," he said, before she had finished the second sentence of her preamble. "Yes," she said. "What are you proposing?" She proposed a regular weekly order, rolls for his kitchen, to be used in the daily meals he offered, and a small selection of loaves for the bread basket he put on each table. She had done the numbers already. She told him the price per unit, and the minimum order quantity, and the delivery arrangement. He did not negotiate much. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, calculating. "Can you do it by 8 on Monday mornings?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then yes," he said. It was the first wholesale account. She walked back to the bakery and wrote it in her notebook and felt, not for the last time, that the festival had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. It had created a context in which people were ready to take a step they had been close to taking anyway. The spiced fruit loaf, in the 2 weeks after the festival, became the most discussed item in the bakery. This had not been planned. She had introduced it as a seasonal offering, with no particular fanfare, simply putting it on the shelf with a small card, the same as any other addition to the range, and it had done what good things do. It spoke for itself. George, the older man who came in on Saturdays, had been the first serious test of it. He had seen it on the shelf the first Saturday it appeared, and he had stood in front of it for a long moment before picking one up. He had bought 2, paid, and walked to the door. He had stopped at the door. "It is close," he had said, without turning. "Very close." She had taken this seriously, which was the correct response. Close. From a man who had been eating bread in this village for 70 years, and remembered what the bakery had been capable of, was not a mild encouragement. It was a specific evaluation. She had gone back to the recipe that afternoon and made a note. More spice. Cut the sugar by 15%. Overnight rest before slicing. The following week, he came in and bought 3 loaves and said nothing at all. This was better than close. The complaint situation, which was what she had come to call the anonymous complaint in her own mind, using the plural as a precaution against complacency, had not repeated itself, at least not as far as she knew. She had no way of knowing whether further complaints had been filed and simply not mentioned to her, but Frederick had not returned to the subject, and the Duke had not raised it, and she had decided that the best and only response to it was to keep her records clean and her work honest, and let the results do the argument. There had been, however, a different form of pressure. In the 3rd week after the festival, she received a call from a bakery in the next market town, 12 miles away, asking whether she was interested in a supply arrangement for their wholesale customers. The call came from a man named Daniel, who was the purchasing manager for a small catering company that worked with several food businesses in the area. He had, he said, heard about the Heathbrook sourdough from a mutual contact, and wanted to discuss whether the bakery could fulfill a weekly supply of 50 loaves. She thanked him and asked him to give her a week before she gave an answer. She thought about it carefully. 50 loaves a week was a significant volume at their current capacity. It would require another adjustment to the production schedule, possibly additional equipment, and would place a dependency on the bakery's output that had to be met consistently, regardless of what else was happening. But the risk was that the wholesale volume would begin to drive the bakery's production at the expense of the village retail trade, which was not a risk she was prepared to take. The bakery existed for the village first. That was not a sentiment. It was a strategy. The village was the foundation on which everything else was built. She called Daniel back and declined. She declined, however, while offering something else, a smaller, regular supply, 15 loaves a week, to begin, with a clear understanding that this was a starting point, not a limitation. If the bakery's capacity increased over time, as she intended it to, the arrangement could grow. This was the honest version of the offer, which was preferable to the version that promised more than she could deliver. Daniel accepted without much discussion, which told her that the 15 loaves were a genuine starting point for him too. 2 wholesale accounts, now, in addition to the growing retail trade. She updated the production schedule to accommodate both, and looked at the new numbers for the week. She was looking at something she had not been looking at before her arrival, a bakery with genuine momentum. Not impressive momentum, not the kind you could boast about, or use to impress anyone, but real momentum, the kind that comes from small things done consistently well, day after day, until the consistency itself becomes the thing people come for. Lucy was, by the end of October, a permanent member of the team. This had happened quietly, without ceremony. The 3-week trial period had ended, and Margaret had spoken to Lucy about it directly and simply, and Lucy had said yes, and that had been that. But the fact of her permanence had changed the quality of the team in ways that were not immediately visible, and then suddenly very visible. Colin had begun teaching her things, not the basic things, which Lucy had picked up quickly from watching and asking, but the subtler things, the knowledge that lives in repetition and is difficult to articulate. The particular feel of a proved dough that is ready for the oven. The way the oven sounds different when the temperature is right. The difference between a roll that looks done and a roll that is done. Margaret watched this happening and said nothing about it to either of them, because it was the kind of thing that benefited from not being named. Patricia, in the same period, had started writing things down. She had begun keeping a small notebook behind the counter, and into it she was recording the things she knew, the techniques she had developed over 9 years, the adjustments specific to the seasons, the customer preferences she had observed, the small operational details that no recipe book contained, but that made the difference between running the counter well and running it perfectly. She was writing it for Lucy, she had said when Margaret noticed it, so that Lucy would have it if needed. Margaret had looked at the notebook. It was extraordinarily detailed. It contained information that would have taken years to accumulate, and that existed, before Patricia wrote it down, only in Patricia's head. The act of writing it down was not just training for Lucy. It was the preservation of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost when Patricia eventually left, which she would eventually do, as everyone eventually did, and which Margaret was already thinking about in the most responsible way possible, which was to make sure the things that mattered were documented, while the person who knew them was still there. "This is very good," Margaret said, looking at the notebook. "It should have been done years ago," Patricia said. "Yes," Margaret said, "but it is being done now." There was a brief shared look between them that required no further words. By the end of October, the bakery was producing more, selling more, and doing it with more people who understood why it mattered than it had been producing at any point in the past 3 years. The revenue was up substantially from the month before Margaret arrived. The waste was down. The range had grown from 5 items to 12. The hours were longer, and the team was stronger, and the bread was better. She wrote the monthly report on the last day of the month, sitting in the office with a cup of tea that had gone cold while she was writing. She was honest about all of it, the things that were working, the things that still needed work, the risks she was watching, the plans she was making. She ended the report with a note about the new wholesale arrangements and what they represented. Then she added a final observation, which was something she did not always include but which felt, this month, important to say. The staff at this bakery are the reason it is working. The technical changes and the business decisions are necessary, but they are not the determining factor. The determining factor is that Colin, Patricia, and Lucy have all chosen, in different ways and at different rates, to invest in what this bakery can be. That investment is what I am most careful to protect. She put the report in the envelope and set it on the desk. She sat for a moment in the quiet office with the cold tea and the hum of the kitchen on the other side of the wall. Then she opened her notebook to the page marked Next and looked at what was written there and added 3 more lines. She had a clear picture now of what the bakery was becoming. The shape of it was visible in a way it had not been when she walked through the door on the first morning with a dustpan and brush and flour on the floor. The shape was specific and honest, and it was not the shape of a place that had been rescued by someone with a plan. It was the shape of a place that had remembered what it was for. That was, she had come to believe, the only kind of recovery that lasted. She went home through the village in the last light of October, the lane dark already at 5:30, the night coming earlier now and the cold making the warm square of each cottage window look particularly deliberate and good. She passed the pub, from which she could hear the early evening sound of it, voices, a brief laugh, the knock of something wooden on a table. She passed the post office with Harriet's handwritten notices still in the window, even though the post office had been closed for 2 hours. She walked the last section of the lane in the dark between street lamps, her feet knowing the path without needing to see it. She thought, 1 more month until Christmas. She thought, the enriched loaf needs 1 more test batch. She thought, I need to talk to Frederick about the equipment situation in the kitchen before the December demand peaks. She did not think about how far she had come since the first morning. The flour on the floor, the cold ovens, Colin looking at her with eyes that expected nothing. There was no use thinking backward when you were moving forward. The only reason to look back was to learn from it, and she had already learned what that beginning had to teach. She turned her key in the door of the hardware shop and went upstairs. She made tea and opened the recipe book and began reading about enriched doughs. She had work to do. The food writer arrived on a Thursday morning, without any warning, and she was gone within the hour, and Margaret did not think too much about her until the article came out 3 weeks later. Her name was Claire Dawson, and she wrote a column for a regional food magazine about small businesses and local food culture, the kind of column that was read mostly by people who cared about where their food came from, and occasionally changed the trajectory of a small producer's life, without either party entirely planning it. She had been, she explained briefly at the counter, visiting the Heathbrook estate for an unrelated reason, and she had been directed to the bakery by someone in the village. Margaret did not ask who had directed her. She had a reasonable suspicion, based on the way Harriet from the post office had been mentioning the bakery to anyone who came through her door for the past 6 weeks, that the direction had come from that quarter. Claire Dawson did not announce herself as a journalist. She came in, looked at the display for a moment, asked 1 or 2 casual questions about the sourdough that were actually quite precise questions if you were listening carefully, bought a sourdough and a bag of rolls and a spiced fruit loaf, and sat at the small table by the window. She ate. She made notes in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She asked Margaret 2 more questions before she left, one about how long Margaret had been running the bakery, and one about whether the recipe for the sourdough was her own or a family recipe, and she thanked her and went. Margaret thought she might write something, and she thought, it will either be good or it will not be relevant, and either way the work is the same. She went back to the kitchen. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday, Frederick Holt came into the bakery at 9 in the morning and set a copy of a magazine on the counter without saying anything. The article was 3 columns long, with a photograph that someone had taken through the bakery window without Margaret being aware of it. A slightly blurred image of the interior, the shelves visible, the light through the window, the quality of the space legible even through the glass. Claire Dawson had written about the sourdough, with the particular specificity of someone who knew bread and was not willing to describe it in vague terms. She had written about the village and the estate, and the way the bakery sat at the intersection of both. She had mentioned Patricia, though not by name, a woman who has worked there for nearly a decade and who knows things about the kitchen that no recipe could contain. And she had mentioned the way the morning queue moved, the efficiency and warmth of the counter, the smell of the place at 8:30 when the morning's first batch was ready. She ended the article with a line that Frederick underlined in pencil before he left the magazine on the counter. Heathbrook Bakery is the kind of place a village is lucky to have, and even luckier to rediscover. Margaret read the article once, thoroughly, at the counter. She put it in the office drawer. She told Patricia and Colin and Lucy at the end of the day. Patricia read it standing at the counter and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said she spelled the sourdough right. This was, in Patricia's vocabulary, the equivalent of enthusiasm. Colin said he had already seen it. His sister-in-law had sent him a photograph of it on her phone. Lucy said, "Does this mean more people will come in?" "Probably," Margaret said. "We should be ready." Being ready, in practical terms, meant 2 things. Being ready for a possible increase in foot traffic, which she was guardedly optimistic about, since the article was regional and not national, and the increase would be manageable rather than unmanageable. And being ready in a more fundamental way, which was the readiness of a team that knew exactly what it was doing and could sustain the quality that the article had described, regardless of how many people were watching. The second kind of readiness was the only one that mattered long-term. In the weeks following the article, the foot traffic did increase. Not dramatically, but measurably and steadily. The kind of increase that comes from people being reminded that a thing exists and being given a specific reason to try it. She saw new faces at the counter, people who mentioned the article in passing or who said that someone had sent them the link online. She saw some of the regulars bring people with them. George brought his younger brother one Saturday morning, which was the first time George had brought anyone, and his brother stood at the display looking at the spiced fruit loaf with an expression that told Margaret he had been told about it specifically. The brother bought 2. George bought his 3 rolls and left without comment, which was now the established pattern and which she had come to find entirely satisfactory. A food retailer from the nearest market town contacted her by letter, an actual letter, handwritten, which she thought was deliberate and respected, asking whether the Heathbrook Bakery was interested in supplying their shop with a weekly selection. She wrote back, also by hand, also deliberate, and arranged a meeting. The meeting went well. She was direct about what she could offer, and honest about the volume constraints, and the retailer was a practical person who appreciated directness, and they reached an agreement that was realistic for both sides. 3 wholesale accounts now. The village retail trade was growing. The opening hours had been extended and were being used. She was, in this period, very busy in a way that felt different from the busyness of the early weeks. In the beginning, the busyness had been the busyness of crisis management, of putting out the fires that were already burning, and creating basic conditions for stability. That kind of busyness was exhausting in a particular way, the exhaustion of using yourself up to prevent something bad from happening. The busyness of this period was different. It was the busyness of someone building something, using herself up in the service of a direction she had chosen, which produced a different kind of tiredness, the kind that felt productive, that accumulated into something rather than simply disappearing. She was sleeping well for the first time in years. She was also, in this period, thinking more carefully about what she was building and what she wanted it to become. She had conversations with Frederick about the kitchen equipment. One of the ovens needed significant maintenance, and she had been managing around its inconsistency for weeks. She put together a written proposal for the repairs, with costings, and a clear argument for why the work was necessary and when it should be done. Frederick presented it to the Duke, and came back with an approval within a week, which was faster than she had expected. She had conversations with Patricia about the range, specifically about which items should remain year-round and which should be seasonal, because the discipline of a seasonal range was both economically sensible and a better way of managing expectations. Seasonal things felt special. Seasonal things gave people a reason to come in during the specific weeks they were available. Patricia had strong opinions about this, and they were, Margaret found, almost always correct. She had a conversation with Colin that she had not been planning to have, but that happened naturally one morning, when they were alone in the kitchen, and he said, without looking up from the dough he was working, "My sister asked me whether she should apply to work here." Margaret looked at him. "How old is she?" 21, he said. "She has done some catering. She is looking for something more permanent." "Can you have her come in and talk to me?" Margaret said. "She is quite like me," Colin said. This was, she had learned, the most complex form of warning he was capable of offering. "That is not necessarily a problem," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She is better with people than I am." "Then she might be very useful," Margaret said. His sister came in the following week. Her name was Naomi, and she was indeed quite like Colin in her quietness and her directness, but she was warmer at the surface, and she had a way of making people at the counter feel seen, without making them feel the object of excessive attention, which was a specific and rare skill. Margaret spoke to her for 20 minutes, and then asked her to come in for a trial Saturday, and the trial Saturday was enough. She was, if everything continued as it was going to need Naomi. The bakery was growing into its capacity faster than she had originally planned for, not because anything had been rushed, but because the conditions had been more favorable than she had projected. Good conditions rewarded good work, faster than difficult conditions did. She had been operating under difficult conditions for long enough to forget this, and the reminder was welcome. The enriched loaf went on sale in the second week of November. She had been testing it for 3 weeks, working through 6 batches with a specific focus on the crumb structure. An enriched loaf, one made with eggs and butter as well as flour, water and yeast, had a different behavior in the oven from a standard bread. The fat in the butter coated the gluten strands, limiting their development and producing the particular tender, close crumb that was the point of the loaf. Managing this required precise timing and a particular care with the temperature, because too much heat too quickly would set the crust before the crumb had finished its work. She got it right on the 6th attempt. The texture of the slice when she cut it was exactly what she had been aiming for, soft and yielding without being dense, with enough structure to hold its shape but enough give to tell you, when you pressed it gently with your thumb, that it was properly made. She tasted it without butter, because she wanted to know what it was, before she knew what it could be with something added. It was good. Genuinely, cleanly good. She put it on sale on a Tuesday, and said nothing special about it. Just added it to the display with a card the same as the others, the name and the price. By Friday, it had sold out every day before noon. Patricia, on the Friday afternoon, said, "We need to make more." "How many?" Margaret said. "Double," Patricia said. They doubled the quantity the following week. It was sold by 11 every morning. In the same period, Claire Dawson's article continued to move through the channels by which good articles move in the age of the internet. Someone shared it. Someone else shared their share. A food blog referenced it briefly. A small regional news site ran a summary of it. None of this produced the kind of dramatic overnight attention that Margaret would have found impossible to manage. It produced a slow and steady increase in awareness of the bakery among people who cared about food in the region, which was exactly the right kind of attention, at the right kind of rate. She received 2 phone calls from journalists wanting to do their own pieces. She said no to both, not because she was averse to attention, but because the bakery was still at a point where the best thing for it was the continued and undisturbed work of the team, not the distraction of a camera crew or a lengthy interview. She was not ready yet for the bakery to be a story. She was ready for the bakery to be a bakery. One of the journalists asked why she was declining. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Because if you write about us now, you are writing about what we were last week. Give us 6 more months, and there will be more to say." There was a silence on the line. Then the journalist said, "That is a very good answer." "It is a true answer," she said. She went back to work. The monthly figures for November were the best since her arrival. The bakery was not just profitable, it was significantly profitable, in a way that was becoming structural rather than circumstantial. The revenue growth was not being driven by the article or the attention or any single factor that could reverse if circumstances changed. It was being driven by the daily accumulation of people who had tasted the bread and come back, and brought someone with them who had also tasted it and come back in turn. This was the only kind of growth she trusted. She wrote the monthly report with a clarity and confidence she had not felt in the earlier months. Not because the work had become easy, it had not, but because the direction was no longer uncertain. She knew where they were going. She knew what they were building. The question now was not whether it would work, but how long it would take to arrive at the next stage of what it could be. She put the report in the envelope. She went home through the November village, which was cold and dark and entirely quiet, at 7 in the evening, the lane empty, the windows lit. She turned the key in the door of the hardware shop and went upstairs and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the recipe book open in front of her. She was thinking about January. She was always thinking about what came next. The conversation she had not been planning to have with Frederick happened on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, when he came in for the weekly order review and stayed longer than usual. He sat across the desk from her in the small office and looked at the November figures she had placed in front of him, and was quiet for longer than usual. "These are quite good," he said, finally. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "The Duke has noticed." She waited. "He mentioned the bakery in a context where he would not typically mention it," Frederick said. "He mentioned it in the context of things on the estate that were working." She held his gaze. "And I am telling you, because I think it is relevant information for you to have," he said. "He is not a person who mentions things unless they are worth mentioning." This was, from Frederick, a considerable statement. She thought about the Duke sitting at the table by the window in the bakery. She had been told by Lucy, who had been at the counter that day and had not recognized him until someone else did, that he had come in on a Tuesday morning and bought the honey rye and sat there for close to an hour. She had not been in the bakery herself that day. She had been at the estate for a meeting with Frederick about the oven repair. She found it interesting that he had come in on the one day she was not there. She had not said anything about this to anyone, but she had thought about it, whether it was coincidence or deliberate, and if deliberate, what it meant. She had decided it meant that he had wanted to observe the bakery without her in it, which was the most informative kind of observation available when you were assessing whether a business's performance depended on the presence of one particular person or was embedded in the operation itself. She had passed that test, she was fairly certain, because the bakery worked the same way whether she was physically present or not. That was one of the things she had been most deliberate about building. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Frederick. He picked up his notebook and stood. "The December figures will be important," he said. "I know," she said. She was already planning for December. She was thinking about the enriched loaf and whether it could be enhanced for the season with something specific. Not a dramatic change, just a particular addition that made it feel like a December loaf, rather than just a good loaf. She was thinking about whether to introduce a seasonal item specifically for the week before Christmas, something that people would come in specifically to buy, and that would be gone by the new year, and whether the team had enough capacity to add one more thing to the range for that brief window, without compromising the regular production. She thought they did. She thought Lucy and Naomi, who was now 2 weeks into her time at the bakery, and was performing better than Margaret had dared to hope, gave them the capacity for one more thing. She went back to the kitchen and told Patricia what she was thinking about. Patricia looked at the ceiling for a moment. "A proper shortbread," she said. "Plain, not fancy. The kind that people buy a tin of and do not eat all at once." "Can we make tins?" Margaret said. "We have tins in the back," Patricia said. From when the previous management tried to do gift boxes and stopped. Margaret looked at her. Did they stop because it did not work, or because they stopped trying? "Both," Patricia said. "Then we try again," Margaret said, "but better." Patricia almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile Margaret had seen on her in 2 months, and it felt like an arrival of something. She went home that evening thinking about shortbread. She was already thinking about what the tin would look like. She was already thinking about the label, which would be simple and handwritten, because everything from the Heathbrook Bakery was handwritten, because handwritten things said that a person had made this and meant it. She turned the key in the door of the hardware shop and went upstairs. Outside, November went on being cold and dark and patient, the way November in England always was, and the village lane was empty, and somewhere across the fields, the estate stood in the dark, large and quiet and still. Inside the rented room above the hardware shop, Margaret Ashford opened the recipe book and began looking for shortbread. December arrived with the particular intensity that December always brought to a food business, and Margaret had been ready for it since the last week of November. She had planned the month the way she planned everything, specifically, in writing, in the order the decisions needed to be made, and the order the actions needed to follow. The enriched loaf would continue through December. The sourdough, and the honey rye, and the rolls, and the brown tin loaves would continue, because these were the foundations of the daily operation, and they did not vary with the season. The spiced fruit loaf, which had established itself as a genuine attraction for the bakery, would continue through December, and perhaps be retired in January to give it its seasonal significance back. And there were the new things. The shortbread had come together more quickly than she expected. Dorothy's recipe book did not have a shortbread recipe, but Margaret had her own, accumulated over years, and adjusted to be the plainest, most honest version of the thing. Butter, flour, a small amount of sugar, a very small amount of salt, nothing else. No flavoring, no additions, nothing that was not already in those 4 ingredients. The quality of the shortbread depended entirely on the quality of the butter and the precision of the baking, and both of those things she could control. Patricia had found the tins in the storage room, stacked in a box in the corner behind the pastry racks. 20 tins of the same small rectangular size, clean and in good condition, relics of an ambition that had not been sustained. They were, Margaret had thought when she saw them, a symbol of the bakery's recent history, the right idea, the right materials, the wrong follow-through. She had taken them out and cleaned them, and decided that they would be the basis of the Christmas tin. The shortbread would go in. Beside it, she was adding a new item, a small ginger biscuit, plain in appearance, but with a depth of flavor that came from using fresh ginger alongside the dried, and from a particular technique Patricia had remembered from a recipe she had made at the bakery years earlier and thought about since. Patricia had described it from memory one afternoon while they were doing the end-of-day cleaning, not as a suggestion exactly, but as a recollection, and Margaret had said, "Let us make it and see," and they had, and it was exactly right. The tin, when it was assembled, the shortbread and the ginger biscuits arranged together, the simple handwritten label Margaret had designed herself on a piece of card, was the kind of thing that looked expensive without being expensive, and that people would give as a gift without feeling they were being frivolous about it. It was a genuine food product, not a confection. It was the bakery's character in a tin. She showed it to Frederick in the first week of December, when he came for the weekly review. He looked at it. He picked it up and looked at the label. He set it down. "How many can you make?" he said. "As many as we need," she said. "We have 20 tins. If the demand exceeds that, I will need to order more." "Order more," he said. "The estate will take 10 for gifts." She had not expected this. She wrote it down. The first week of December was the busiest week the bakery had experienced since the festival, and the second week was busier than the first. The tins sold steadily, not in a rush. People came in and saw them in the display, and thought about them, and sometimes came back the next day to buy them, which told her they were the right price, and the right kind of thing. The regular bread sold at the normal rate. The enriched loaf sold out earlier each day as the month went on. She was managing all of this with a team of 5, herself, Colin, Patricia, Lucy, and Naomi, and the 5 of them had by December settled into a working rhythm that was the closest thing to genuine collaboration she had seen in a professional context in a long time. They knew each other's tendencies and accommodated them. They communicated briefly and accurately. They worked with an efficiency that was not mechanical but living, the efficiency of people who cared about the same outcome and had learned how to move around each other in a shared space without friction. Colin had become, over the months since her arrival, something she had not initially identified him as potentially being, a leader. Not in a formal or vocal way. He was still quieter than most, still unlikely to address a group directly, but in the way that certain people lead by the quality of their own work and the standard they hold themselves to, which sets an expectation that the people around them absorb without noticing. The younger members of the team watched Colin, not consciously, not with the explicit recognition of what they were doing, but in the way that people watch someone who is very good at what they do, and from whom the watching is itself a form of learning. She thought about this one morning, while watching him teach Naomi the particular wrist motion for scoring a sourdough loaf, the way the blade had to move quickly and decisively through the surface of the dough, committing to the cut without hesitating, because hesitation produced a dragged cut that never opened cleanly. He was showing her without words, doing it slowly, and then doing it at normal speed, and letting her try, and when she tried, and it was not quite right, he did not comment on the wrongness. He took the scoring knife and showed the motion again, more slowly, and handed it back. It was exactly the way Dorothy had taught, the direct, physical, patient way, the way that trusted the other person's ability to understand what they were being shown, without needing it explained in words. She had not told Colin about Dorothy. She had told Patricia, briefly, and Patricia had told the others in the natural course of conversation. But whatever Colin knew about her grandmother, the method he used to teach was his own, arrived at through some combination of instinct and his own experience of being taught. It meant that the thing Dorothy had given her was being transmitted further, not the recipes, not the specific techniques, but the underlying understanding of how to learn a physical skill and how to give that learning to someone else. She found this extraordinary in a quiet way. She found many things extraordinary in a quiet way during December. The shortbread tin that the Duke's estate bought 10 of and distributed to the estate staff, the spiced fruit loaf that George now came in for twice a week rather than once, and which he had told Patricia, in confidence, that Patricia immediately and without apology relayed to Margaret, was the best thing the bakery had made in his memory. The card that arrived at the bakery in the second week of December, addressed to the Heathbrook Bakery team, from a woman who had come in at the festival and had, she wrote, been using the sourdough every week since, and wanted them to know that her daughter, who had not been eating bread for 2 years, for reasons she did not specify, had eaten an entire slice of the sourdough without prompting, after smelling it through the kitchen, and had said it was good, and this had been one of the best things that had happened to the family in some time. Margaret read the card twice and put it on the wall above the office desk, where it stayed. The complexity of this kind of work, the work of running a place that mattered to people, was something she thought about often in December, often late in the evenings, when the bakery was closed, and the accounts were done, and she was sitting with the recipe book open in front of her, not reading it exactly, more in the way you sit with a familiar thing that you want near you. The complexity was this: a bakery was not just a business. It was a part of the texture of people's lives. It was in the background of their mornings, the smell of their kitchens when they brought a loaf home, the small, reliable pleasure of a thing that was there when they wanted it, and was what it said it was. The responsibility that came with that was not a burden, exactly. She did not experience it as a burden. But it was real. Real in the way that a commitment made to a community was real, which was different from a commitment made only to the people immediately around you. She had thought about this when she decided to decline the large wholesale enquiry in October. She had thought about it when she set the pricing for the Christmas tins. Not so high that they became a luxury item that only some people could afford. Not so low that they did not cover what they actually cost to make. She thought about it every time she adjusted the range, every time she considered extending the hours, every time she made any decision that would change what the bakery was for anyone who relied on it. A bakery was not, she had concluded sometime around December, a bakery in the abstract. It was this bakery, for these people, in this village, in this particular moment of this village's life. Those specifics were not constraints. They were the whole point. Christmas week arrived, and the bakery handled it. They had planned for it carefully, and the planning held. The queue on the Saturday before Christmas was the longest queue the bakery had seen since Margaret arrived. It reached the door and bent out onto the pavement for a period of about 40 minutes, which she had anticipated, and which they had prepared for, by having all 5 of them on shift, and by having made the day's production in larger quantities than usual, starting at 3 in the morning, rather than 4:30. Colin had been the one to propose the 3 o'clock start time. He had mentioned it to her a week before, with the matter-of-fact certainty that had become his way of making suggestions that were too obviously correct to be framed as suggestions. They sold out of the Christmas tins by noon. They sold out of the sourdough by 10:30. The enriched loaf lasted until 2 o'clock. The regular range held through the afternoon. At 4:30, Naomi turned the door sign to closed and Patricia cashed up the till, and Lucy and Colin washed the last trays, and Margaret stood at the window of the kitchen, looking at the alley behind the bakery, where the waste bins stood in the last light of the afternoon, and was very still for a moment. She was thinking, with a clarity that felt almost like surprise, that she had done it. Not done it in the sense of finished. A bakery was never finished. The work never stopped. The next day always arrived with its 4:30 alarm, and its cold kitchen, and its ovens that needed turning on. But done it in the sense of brought this place back to something that worked, something that mattered, something that the people of Heathbrook Village would feel the absence of if it stopped existing. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole of what she had set out to do. She turned from the window. Lucy was making tea. Colin was stacking the last trays. Patricia was writing something in her notebook, the operational one, the one she kept for Lucy and Naomi, the one that was growing more detailed each week with the accumulated knowledge of 9 years. Naomi was holding the day's cash sheet and looking at the total with an expression that suggested she had not expected the number to be that large. "Good day," Naomi said. "Very good day," Margaret said. She made tea with Lucy and they drank it together in the kitchen, the 5 of them, in the particular quiet of a kitchen after a very long production day, and it was a different kind of quiet from the quiet of the empty bakery on her first morning, not cold and indifferent, but warm, the quiet of people who have worked hard together, in a shared space, and are comfortable in each other's presence without needing to fill the silence with words. She went home through the village in the dark December evening, the lane strung with the small white lights that the village council put up each year in the first week of December, and took down on the 6th of January. The bakery's window was dark now, the sign turned to closed, the shelves empty, and the floor swept. She stood outside it for a moment. She looked at the sign. She thought, in the morning. She turned and walked home. The rest of the Christmas week held in the way that a well-made plan holds, not without tension, but without breaking. There was a moment on the Wednesday before Christmas when the cold store failed briefly, and they lost a quantity of butter that she could not quickly replace through the usual supplier. She called Graham Hartley directly, at 7 in the evening, explaining the situation without drama. He rang back 20 minutes later to say that his brother-in-law, who ran a dairy farm 8 miles away, could supply her tomorrow morning. She called the brother-in-law. He could. The butter arrived at 6:30 the next morning in the back of a Land Rover and was, if anything, better than what she had been using. She made a note to introduce herself properly to the brother-in-law in January and to discuss a potential ongoing arrangement. A direct relationship with a dairy farmer was worth having. There was a moment on the Thursday when Naomi, who had been managing the counter solo for the first time during a moderately busy mid-morning, came through to the kitchen looking slightly pale and said that there was a woman at the counter who was unhappy about something, and she was not sure how to handle it. Margaret went to the front, listened to the woman, who had been given a loaf that had, she said, a denser section near the base that she did not think was right, and said that the woman was correct and the loaf was not at the standard they held themselves to, and she replaced it immediately and apologized without excessive explanation, because excessive explanation of a mistake was a form of arguing about it. The woman left satisfied. Margaret went back to the kitchen and told the team what had happened and why she had handled it that way, because a customer who is treated honestly when something goes wrong is more likely to come back than a customer who is treated as though they are mistaken. Colin said, "Which oven produced that batch?" She told him. He checked the temperature log. He found the issue, a brief fluctuation during the early part of the bake, and adjusted the calibration settings and told her what he had done. She thanked him. The rest of the day's production from that oven was correct. This was, she thought, the team at its best. A problem identified, addressed, understood, corrected, and communicated, without blame and without drama, by the people closest to the work. This was what she had been trying to build since the first morning. She had built it. It was not finished. It would never be finished, because the kind of team culture she was describing was not a destination but a practice, something that had to be renewed in every decision and every interaction, something that eroded without constant attention. But it was real. It was present. It was visible in the way they handled a Thursday morning crisis with a customer and a miscalibrated oven, quietly and well. Christmas Eve was the last day before the closure. She had decided early in the month that the bakery would be closed on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, which was right, and which the team had accepted without question. She had also decided that the Christmas Eve closure time would be extended to 5 o'clock, because people would want bread on Christmas Eve, and she wanted to be there for that need until the last reasonable moment. The Christmas Eve queue at 8 in the morning was longer than anything she had seen. It was also the most cheerful queue she had managed, which was a seasonal thing and also something more. People came to the bakery on Christmas Eve with a particular warmth, a readiness to be pleased, a willingness to talk to the strangers around them in the queue, in the way that people talk to strangers, in a shared space they all feel good about being in. She heard conversations through the window from the pavement outside, about the bread, about the village, about the estate, about what the bakery had been like in previous years, when they had bought here as children. She heard one woman say to another, "It has not been this good in years." She went back to the kitchen and did not let herself think about it too much, because thinking about it too much was how you started making mistakes. They closed at 5 o'clock as planned, and the shelves were empty. She locked the door and walked to the village end of the lane and stood there for a moment in the Christmas Eve dark, the small lights overhead, the sound of something, a carol, from the pub most likely, floating faintly from somewhere down the street. She thought about Dorothy, who had made Christmas bread every year in the small cottage kitchen, who had sent Margaret home after the Christmas visits with a loaf wrapped in a cloth, and had never said anything sentimental about it, but had always, Margaret remembered now, chosen the best loaf from the batch to send with her. She thought about that for a moment. Then she turned and walked home. She had 2 days off. She intended to use them to plan January. January began the way January always begins, with the abrupt end of everything festive, the return to ordinary light and ordinary cold, and the particular clarity that comes to a business after a peak period, when the numbers are finally settled, and the reality of what comes next becomes the only thing there is. Margaret welcomed January. She had always thought of it as the most honest month, undecorated, unapologetic, making no effort to be anything other than what it was. She had used the 2 days of the Christmas closure well, as she had intended, and she came back to the bakery on the 27th with a clear picture of what January needed to accomplish, and what February, after it, would need to build toward. The picture was not without complications. The first complication arrived in the second week of January, in the form of a notice in the window of a premises on the main street of the next market town, visible when she drove through on her way to a supplier appointment, a new bakery, opening in February, with a sign that said, "Artisan Bread. Best prices, fresh daily." She read the sign as she drove past and did not stop. She filed it in the part of her mind that held useful information and drove on to her appointment. On the way back, she stopped and read the sign more carefully. The new bakery was not in Heathbrook. It was 12 miles away, which meant it was not a direct competitor for the village trade, but it was in the catchment area for some of the people who drove through Heathbrook to get to the town, people who currently stopped at the bakery on their commute because it was convenient and had become, over the past months, worth the stop. If the new bakery was cheaper, some of those people would start stopping there instead. She was not alarmed. She was alert. She had not built the Heathbrook Bakery's recovery on the assumption that no competition would ever appear. She had built it on the assumption that if the quality and the community connection were genuine, they would be sufficient to hold the people who valued them against any reasonable competitive pressure. The people who came to the Heathbrook Bakery because it was cheap were not people she was primarily serving. The people who came because of what the bread was and what the bakery was were the people who would not leave because a sign elsewhere said, "Best prices." But she noted it. She would watch it. The second complication arrived from inside the estate. In the third week of January, Frederick came to see her with a document in his hand rather than his usual notebook, which was unusual enough that she paid particular attention. The document was a proposal. It had been submitted to the estate management. Through what channel? Frederick said carefully. He was not entirely sure. Suggesting that the bakery premises would be better used as a shared commercial kitchen facility that could be rented out to local food producers on a weekly basis. The proposal argued that this was a more financially efficient use of the space and the equipment, that it would generate steady income without the operational complexity of running a retail business, and that the bakery, as currently constituted, was not meeting its potential as a commercial asset. She read the proposal. She read it thoroughly, and without rushing, which meant that Frederick sat across the desk from her in silence for 6 minutes while she did. When she finished, she looked up. "Who wrote this?" she said. "It was submitted anonymously," Frederick said. She looked at him. Again. "Yes," he said. He did not look happy about this. She set the document down. "Is the Duke giving this any weight?" "He has asked for my view," Frederick said, "and yours." "My view," she said, "is that this proposal is written by someone who does not understand the difference between a commercial asset and a community institution, and who has not read the revenue figures for the past 3 months." She paused. "Or who has read them and wants to make this argument anyway, for reasons that have nothing to do with the financial welfare of the estate." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "That is a strong characterization." "It is an accurate one," she said. "The bakery is outperforming the projections the Duke and I discussed at the beginning of my tenure. It is generating goodwill for the estate in the village that does not appear on a balance sheet, but is real. And it is providing reliable employment for 5 local people who would not have those positions if the bakery were converted to something else." She looked at him. "I will write a formal response to this proposal. I would like it placed alongside the proposal itself when it is presented to the Duke." "That is appropriate," Frederick said. She wrote the response that evening, 3 pages, specific, factual, without rancor, arguing each point the proposal had made, and providing the counter-evidence in clear language. She was not angry writing it. She was focused. The proposal was a problem to be addressed with the same precision she brought to any other problem. She sent it to Frederick the next morning. In the same week, a third thing arrived. Another anonymous complaint to the estate. This one focused specifically on the extended opening hours, and the assertion that the increased foot traffic near the end of the lane was causing a nuisance to a nearby property. She read about this complaint from Frederick's note, and spent approximately 30 seconds thinking about it. Then she wrote a brief response, noting that the extended hours had been in place for 3 months, that she was not aware of any formal noise complaints or access issues, and that she would be happy to meet with any affected resident to discuss their concerns directly, which was an offer she fully expected would not be taken up. It was not taken up. 3 things in 1 month. A new competitor in the wider area, an internal proposal to convert the bakery to something else, and another anonymous complaint. She looked at all 3 of them and thought about what they had in common, which was that they all, in different ways, were tests of whether the bakery's recovery was robust enough to withstand pressure. She thought it was. She thought the evidence was clear that it was. But she would not say so aloud, and she would not assume that being right made the pressure less real. She spoke to the team on the Wednesday of the 3rd week, as she usually did on Wednesdays, when there was something to say that the team needed to hear. She told them about the new bakery opening in town. She told them what she believed it meant, which was that there was now more competition in the wider area for people who bought bread on the basis of price. She told them what she believed this required of the Heathbrook Bakery, which was not a change in direction, but a deepening of it. More consistency, not less. More quality, not a comfortable settling at the current level. The answer to competition was always to become more yourself, not less. She did not tell them about the internal proposal to convert the bakery. That was a matter between her and the estate management, and it was being handled. They did not need to carry that. But she told them something else, which was the thing she had been thinking about for several weeks, and which she wanted to say clearly before it became necessary to say urgently. She said, "The reason the bakery is in the position it is in is that each of you chose to care about the same thing. That is not a given. That is a choice, made by specific people, and it can be unmade. What I want you to understand is that I see it, and that I know it is the thing that actually matters. The bread is the bread, because of you, not because of the recipes, not because of the equipment, because of you." She said this without sentimentality. It was simply the true thing, and the true thing needed to be said plainly. Colin, looking at the counter, said, "Right." Naomi said, "I want to stay here, properly. If there is a future here." Margaret looked at her. "There is a future here," she said. "I am building it." The new bakery in town opened in February, as planned, with a launch day that apparently drew a considerable crowd based on a discount offer. She heard about this from 3 different customers in 1 week, mentioned in passing, in the way that people mention things they have noticed and are curious about. She listened without volunteering strong opinions. In the same week, the Heathbrook Bakery had its best Wednesday in its recorded history, based on the comparative figures Patricia kept. This was not because of anything special she had done on that Wednesday. It was because of the accumulation of everything that had been done on every previous day. She took that as her answer. Meanwhile, the question of the conversion proposal moved through the estate management process and came back to her with a response from the Duke that Frederick delivered in person. The proposal had been noted and set aside. The bakery's current use would continue. No further explanation was offered, because none was needed. She thanked Frederick and went back to work. The February range included 2 new additions she had been working on through January. The first was a plain oat loaf, using oats from a supplier she had found through Graham Hartley, who had introduced her to his supplier network with the particular warmth of a person who has been treated honestly and is repaying it in kind. The oat loaf was a dense, sustaining loaf with a specific and satisfying flavor and a texture that held well over 2 days, which made it the right choice for people who did not get to the bakery every morning. It sold steadily and without drama, which was the best outcome for a bread that was meant to be part of ordinary life. The second addition was a small savory pastry, cheese, and a particular dried herb that Patricia had suggested, and which turned out to be the kind of thing that people came in specifically for in the later afternoon, when they had missed lunch and wanted something that was not sweet. It became, within 3 weeks, the most popular afternoon item on the menu. She observed this and thought, Patricia knew this would happen. She said to Patricia, "You knew the afternoon savory would work." Patricia said, "I have been watching this counter for 9 years. I know what people want when they come in after 3 o'clock. Why did you not suggest it earlier?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "No one asked," she said. Margaret thought about this for several days. She thought about all the knowledge that existed in quiet people who had not been asked. The specific, experiential, irreplaceable knowledge that belonged to people who had been in the same place long enough to understand it from the inside. She thought about how much of that knowledge was lost every time a person left a job without anyone having taken the trouble to find out what they knew. She went back to Patricia's operational notebook, the one she had been writing for Lucy and Naomi. She sat with Patricia one afternoon and went through it together, and she asked Patricia to add a section on customer patterns, not just what people bought, but when they came and why, and what the afternoon customers were different from, and what the early morning customers were different from, what the Saturday regulars were looking for, that the weekday walk-ins were not. Patricia spent 2 evenings writing that section. It was extraordinary. It was, Margaret thought, one of the most useful documents the bakery had ever produced. She made a copy of it and put it in the office file. She told Patricia that her salary was being increased with effect from the 1st of March, because what Patricia knew was worth more than what she had been paid for knowing it. Patricia said, "Thank you." She said it simply, not with excessive relief, the way someone says thank you when something is right and they are acknowledging that it is right. The bakery went on being the bakery. The anonymous complaints did not recur. The conversion proposal was not raised again. The new bakery in town continued to attract people who came for the discounts, and the Heathbrook Bakery continued to attract people who came for the bread. By the end of February, the bakery's revenue was higher than at any point in the records she had access to. She wrote the monthly report that evening and did not allow herself to feel more than a moment of satisfaction at the number before she moved on to what February had taught her and what she intended to do differently in March. There was always something to do differently. That was the point. She went home through the February dark, which had already begun to lighten slightly at the edges, the days getting longer, by increments you could not measure individually, but that accumulated into a visible change over weeks. Spring was coming in its unhurried way. She was already thinking about what the bakery would do in spring. Spring arrived in the way that spring always arrived in the English countryside. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic announcement, but in the accumulation of smaller signs that individually meant little and collectively meant everything. The light changed first, shifting from the flat white of February to a quality that was almost gold in the early morning. The light she opened the bakery into at 5 o'clock every day, which was now the light of a season rather than the light of darkness. The trees along the lane showed the first pale green at the tips of their branches in the second week of March. The air, when she walked to the bakery, had something in it that was different from cold. Not warm yet, but no longer winter. Something that would become warm if you gave it another few weeks. She noticed all of this the way she noticed most things in her life now, while walking to or from the bakery, while thinking about what came next, while turning over in her mind the particular problem of the current week that needed solving. The current week's problem, in mid-March, was the afternoon savory pastry. The cheese and herb pastry had been popular since its introduction, and was now a reliable afternoon seller, which meant it was no longer filling a gap in the range, but was a staple, and a staple needed to be consistent in a way that an experiment did not. She had noticed a slight variation in the herb flavor across the past 3 batches. Not dramatic, just enough to tell her that the herb blend was not being measured precisely enough, and that whoever was making the pastry was eyeballing the quantity, rather than weighing it. This was the kind of thing that was easy to let go, because the variation was small enough that most customers would not notice. She was not prepared to let it go. She called the team together one morning, and put a batch of the pastries on the counter, and had everyone taste one. Then she asked Colin to make another batch, measuring the herbs to the gram, and had everyone taste that one too. The difference was there. Not enormous, but there. She said, "This is the difference between the first and what it has become. All weighing. Every time. No exceptions." Naomi said, "I have been eyeballing it. I am sorry." "I know," Margaret said. "That is why I am saying it to everyone, and not to you specifically. It is easy to do, and it changes the product." Naomi nodded. The batch the following morning was correct. These were the ordinary details of the work. She had come to understand, in the months since her arrival, that the management of a bakery was almost entirely made up of ordinary details, of the 100 small decisions and observations and corrections that constituted a day's work in a kitchen making food that had to be right. None of these details were dramatic. None of them were the kind of thing that would make an interesting story to tell someone at a dinner party. They were simply the work, and the work was everything. She had also come to understand something about herself in this period, which was that she was, in fact, suited to this work in a way that went beyond technical competence. She was suited to it because she could pay sustained attention to the same things over and over, without becoming impatient with the repetition, could find the daily practice of quality control genuinely important rather than tedious, could treat a minor inconsistency in an herb blend with the same seriousness she would bring to a significant crisis. This was not a common quality in people who ran businesses. Many people who were excellent at building things were terrible at maintaining them. She was, she had concluded, equally good at both, or good enough at both that the combination produced something functional. She had also come to understand that she liked these people. She had not expected to like them. She had expected to respect them, to work well with them, to invest in their development and appreciate their contributions. But she had come to like them in the fuller and more personal sense. Colin's dry precision, his complete lack of performance about anything, his growing pride in the bread that he showed only through the care he took with it. Patricia's 9 years of knowledge held so lightly that she had almost forgotten she had it until she started writing it down, and the way she had transformed over the past months, from a woman going through the motions into a woman who came in 10 minutes early and checked on the proving trays before anyone asked her to. Lucy's directness and her speed of learning, Naomi's warmth, which was the most visible thing about her, and also the least of what she offered. She did not say any of this to them. It was not the kind of thing she said, but she held it privately, in the way you hold things that are true and important and do not require announcement. The spring brought with it one other thing that she had not anticipated, but that she found, when it arrived, entirely right. A local primary school teacher, a young man named Richard who bought bread every few days and whose classes she had occasionally seen walking past the bakery window, asked whether the bakery would ever consider doing a visit for his class of 8-year-olds. He said it would be part of a term's work they were doing on how local businesses operated, on food and where it came from, on the relationship between the land and what people made from it. She thought about it for approximately 2 minutes. She said yes. She told Colin that he would be doing most of the demonstrating, because his patience with children had been established at the festival, and because she believed that what the children were seeing when they saw Colin work with dough was something worth seeing, not only the technique, but the seriousness with which a skilled person gave their attention to a physical thing. Colin said, "How many of them?" 26, she said. He nodded. She could see him calculating what he needed in front of 26 children, and what the kitchen space would permit. The school visit happened on a Thursday morning in mid-March, in the quiet period between the morning rush and the lunchtime delivery. 26 children came in a line along the lane, in pairs, holding hands with each other, in the way of children who have been told to hold hands, and have accepted this as the correct arrangement. They came into the bakery and looked at everything with the particular wide-eyed attention that children bring to a new space, and Colin stood at the proving bench with a piece of dough in front of him and introduced himself without ceremony, and began showing them what he did. Margaret stood near the door and watched. She watched Colin cut the dough into pieces and press one piece into each pair of hands, and watched the children feel it. The cold smoothness of it, the way it stretched when you pressed a finger into it, the way it slowly came back. She heard the questions. Does it hurt when you cut it? Why is it cold? What is the smell? Is it alive? She heard Colin answer them, plainly and accurately, in the language of someone who was not talking down, but was simply being clear, which children respond to better than almost any other form of communication. She saw one small girl, in the middle of the group, press her piece of dough very gently, with one finger, and then look up at Colin, with a completely serious expression, and say, "Is this the same dough that becomes the bread?" "Yes," Colin said. The girl looked at the dough in her hands for a moment. Then she looked at the shelves, where the morning's bread was on display. She seemed to be making a connection between the two things, the raw and the made, in the way you make connections when a piece of understanding arrives fully formed, from the inside. She looked back at Colin. "That is amazing," she said. Colin looked at her. He said, "Yes, it is." He said it without irony and without modesty, with the simple directness of a person who believed the thing he was saying. Margaret looked out the window at the lane and the trees with their new leaves, and she thought, yes, it is. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The work continued. The morning the Duke came through the front door of the Heathbrook Bakery was a Tuesday in late March, and Margaret was not there. This was not an accident. She had been at the estate for a meeting with Frederick about the summer production planning, a forward-looking conversation about capacity and demand, and what the warmer months would bring in terms of customer patterns. The estate meeting had been in the diary for 2 weeks, arranged well in advance, at a time she had not thought twice about. She learned about the Duke's visit from Lucy, who had been at the counter when he came in. "A man came in," Lucy said, when Margaret returned to the bakery at 11:30. "An older man, well-dressed but not showy about it. He bought the honey rye and sat at the window table for a long time." "How long?" Margaret asked. Lucy thought about it. "Nearly an hour." Margaret nodded. "He did not say much. He had a way of looking around that was, I am not sure how to describe it, careful, like he was assessing things." "Did you recognize him?" Lucy paused. "After he left, the woman who came in after him told me who he was." She met Margaret's eyes. It was the Duke. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He sat there for an hour," she said. "Yes," Lucy said. "He watched the counter. He watched the kitchen door. He watched the queue, when there was a queue." She hesitated. Was he checking on us?" "Yes," Margaret said. "He was." "Should I have done something differently?" "No," Margaret said. "You should have done exactly what you did." She went into the office and sat at the desk and thought about what Lucy had described. The Duke had come in without announcement, on a morning he knew she would not be present, and had sat for an hour watching the bakery operate. He had come to see the bakery without her in it. He had come to see whether what she had built was dependent on her presence, or whether it existed independently, whether it was a Margaret Ashford bakery or a Heathbrook bakery. This was the correct test. It was the test she would have designed herself. She thought about what he had seen. Lucy at the counter, confident and warm and accurate. Patricia moving through the space with the economical efficiency of 9 years, plus the renewed energy of the past months. The display arranged as it always was, the bread in good condition, the shelves not bare by 11 o'clock. Colin's voice from the kitchen, audible only as occasional sound, the regular rhythm of the work. She hoped he had liked what he saw. She was fairly confident he had liked what he saw. Frederick called that afternoon, which confirmed it. He said the Duke would like to meet with her at 6 o'clock. She said she would be there. She spent the rest of the afternoon working. She did not spend it preparing what she would say or anticipating what he would say. She had found, over the months of monthly reports and occasional meetings, that the Duke was a person who responded better to genuine answers than to prepared ones, and that the most useful thing she could do before any conversation with him was to know her own mind clearly, which she already did. At 5:30 she locked the bakery, thanked the team, and walked to the estate. Frederick met her in the hall and took her to the room she had been in before, the larger room with the lamp and the table. The Duke was already seated. There was tea, as there had been at the last formal meeting, and she sat down and took the cup when it was offered. He said, "I was in the bakery this morning." "I know," she said. "Lucy told me." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. A slight adjustment. The look of a person who has been caught doing something that was not quite hidden. She recognized me. "Not immediately," Margaret said. "But yes, eventually." He was quiet for a moment. "What did she say about it?" She asked whether she should have done something differently. "And?" "I told her no," Margaret said. He picked up his cup. He looked at it for a moment. "What I saw this morning," he said, "was a bakery that did not need you to be in it to operate at the level I was expecting." He set the cup down. "That is not as easy to achieve as it sounds." "No," she said. "The previous managers were all in the bakery," he said. "All three of them. They were there every day, and when anything happened, they were the only person who knew what to do about it. The bakery depended on them being present." He looked at her. "That is not a bakery. That is a person standing in a kitchen." "Yes," she said. "What you have built is different." "I tried to build something that would survive me," she said. "Not because I plan to leave. I do not plan to leave. But because a thing that cannot function without one specific person is fragile in a way that a thing built of distributed knowledge is not. If I am ill, the bakery still opens. If I am away for a week, the bread is still right." He nodded. "That requires trusting people." "Yes," she said. "It does." The previous managers did not trust the staff. "I could see that from the accounts," she said. "From the records. From the state the kitchen was in when I arrived. When people are not trusted, they stop trying. And then their not trying confirms the original decision not to trust them. It is a circle that closes quickly." He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize in him. The full, considered attention of a person who was listening, not only to the words, but to the structure behind the words. "You broke the circle," he said. "The staff broke the circle," she said. "I gave them a reason to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to offer you a permanent contract." She had been expecting this. She had been expecting it since Frederick's comment 2 months earlier, about the Duke noticing things that were working. She had been expecting it in the particular way that you expect a thing you have been working toward, without allowing yourself to admit that you are working toward it, because admitting it creates a kind of hope that is fragile and distracting, and she did not have room for fragile or distracting things. "Not a continuation of the trial arrangement," he said. "A proper contract. Full management authority over the bakery. A salary that I believe is fair for what you have accomplished. And a budget for the kitchen renovation I have been aware is overdue." The kitchen renovation. She had not asked for it. She had been managing around the equipment limitations with the ingenuity that constraint produces, but she had known for months that the kitchen needed updating. The old oven that she calibrated carefully every morning to compensate for its inconsistency. The storage arrangement that was inefficient and had been inefficient for years. The single sink that was too small for the volume the kitchen now produced. She had put it in no report. She had not wanted to seem to be asking for things beyond the specific task she had been given. He had noticed anyway. Of course he had noticed. She said, "I accept." He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, in the way of a person who has more to say and is deciding how to say it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I told you at the beginning that I had offered this position to 3 other people. What I did not tell you is that I had also considered closing the bakery entirely. That was, when you arrived, the most likely outcome." She looked at him. "I had a report prepared that outlined the process for winding it down, returning the premises to general estate use, handling the staff arrangements. It was ready. I did not implement it, because one of the people who works for me said something that gave me pause." He paused. "Frederick said that the village would not recover quickly from losing the bakery, He said that there were things a community loses when it loses a bakery that do not easily come back, and that in his experience, they were always underestimated until they were gone. She thought about Frederick, who walked past the bakery every day, who bought a loaf every Friday, who said very little that was not precisely what needed to be said. "That is what changed your mind?" she said. "It was the first thing that changed my mind," he said. "And then you came and asked to see the bakery before you gave me an answer." He looked at her with something she had not seen in his expression before. Not warmth exactly, but something close to respect in its truest form, which was the recognition of something genuine. And I thought, this person understands what they are taking on. Let us see what they do with it. The walk home through the spring evening was the longest she had taken since arriving in Heathbrook. Not in distance, she walked the same lane she always walked, but in what she took in as she walked it. She walked slowly. She looked at the lane, and the cottages, and the trees with their new leaves, and the lights coming on in the windows as the evening settled in. She passed the post office where Harriet had put her first card in the window, and told visitors about the bakery, with the particular authority of someone who considered it their personal recommendation to make. She passed the pub where Philip had been talking about the bread for months, with the cheerful insistence of a man who liked the bread and wanted everyone to know it. She passed the school, closed now at this hour, and thought about 26 children pressing their hands into dough and the seriousness with which they had all treated it. She stood outside the bakery for a long time. The window was dark. The sign was visible in the street lamp, Heathbrook Bakery. She had never considered changing the sign. It was the right sign. It said what it needed to say about what the place was and who it was for. She looked at it and thought about her grandmother, who had known this village for 30 years and had sold her bread at the market and been remembered for it. She thought about the recipe book in her bag, still there, still the thing she reached for when she was thinking her way through a problem. She thought about the first morning, and the flour on the floor, and Colin with his empty eyes, and the cold kitchen that smelled of nothing. She thought about what it had taken to get from there to here. She turned and walked home. In the morning she was at the bakery at 5 o'clock, as always. She turned the key and pushed the door open and was met by the smell of the kitchen, the cool flour and stone smell of before the heat started, the smell of a space that was ready to become something. She put on the apron. She turned on the ovens. She began. Colin arrived at 4:49. He had put the kettle on before she got there, which meant he had been in the kitchen for several minutes already, which was unusual even for him. She noticed it without commenting on it, and he made no comment either, and they worked together in the early morning quiet, with the ease that had developed between them over months of shared mornings. At some point before 6, when the first batches were in the oven, and they were both at the counter preparing the proving trays, he said without looking up, "I heard something yesterday." She waited. "From Patricia," he said. "She said Frederick came in and mentioned that there might be changes." She looked at him. What kind of changes? She was not sure. She said Frederick seemed pleased about it. Margaret considered this. Frederick, who said precisely what he meant, and nothing beyond it, who had once described a very good sourdough as received well, and had let that stand as his full expression of appreciation. Frederick seeming pleased was a significant thing. "There are some changes," she said, "but they are good ones. I will tell everyone at the morning meeting." He nodded. He went back to the proving trays. She watched him for a moment, his hands moving with the efficiency and care that she had watched develop from almost nothing, the particular quality of attention he gave to everything in the kitchen that he had not given to anything on the first morning. She thought about what the Duke had said, that the bakery did not need her to be in it to function at the right level. He had said it as a compliment to her management. She had received it as a compliment to her team. Patricia arrived at 7 and noticed immediately that something was different, in the way that Patricia noticed everything about the quality of a space the moment she entered it. She looked at Margaret and said, "Well?" "Wait for the full meeting," Margaret said. Patricia accepted this with the patience of someone who has waited longer than this for many things. Lucy and Naomi arrived together, having apparently met on the lane. Naomi had a slight excitement about her that was visible even in her ordinary Tuesday morning manner. Lucy was carrying an extra bag, from which she produced, at the counter, a small cake wrapped in paper that she set beside the till without explanation. "What is that?" Margaret asked. "For later," Lucy said. "I thought we might be celebrating something." Margaret looked at her. "Harriet mentioned something to my mother," Lucy said, "and my mother mentioned something to me." Margaret thought, Harriet, of course. She gathered them in the kitchen at 7:20, in the 10 minutes between the first batches going in and the counter opening. She told them about the meeting at the estate. She told them about the permanent contract and the management authority and the salary. She told them about the kitchen renovation, which she had been thinking about since she heard it the previous evening, and which she already had preliminary ideas about that she would need to discuss with Frederick and a building surveyor. She told them that none of it would mean anything without them. She said that simply and without decoration, because it was the true thing, and the true thing did not need decoration. Colin said nothing. He was looking at the floor in the way he looked at the floor when something was affecting him that he did not have words for. Patricia said, "About time." She said it in exactly the way she had said, "about time," when the extended hours were introduced, which Margaret had by now understood was her highest form of approval, the acknowledgement that something correct had finally occurred. Lucy said, "Can we open the cake now?" "After the opening," Margaret said. The morning was busy in the ordinary way of a Tuesday, not the peak of a weekend, not the long quiet of the Tuesday months before, but a steady, purposeful traffic of people who were there because they had decided to be there, and who came back because what they had found previously had been worth coming back to. The queue at 8 o'clock was 8 people deep, which was now the ordinary Tuesday morning queue, and no longer something she needed to specifically note. At 9:30 she stood at the counter for a moment with no one immediately in front of her, which happened occasionally, and looked at the display. The bread arranged as she arranged it, the card with the sourdough's description, the small vase of early spring flowers that Naomi had started putting on the counter 3 weeks ago, and that Margaret had not told her to do, and had not told her to stop. She looked at all of it. She thought, this is the thing. Not the contract, not the authority, not even the recognition, which was real, and which she had wanted, honestly, in the way that everyone wants recognition, for work that has cost them something. The thing was this: a clean, warm, working bakery on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small English village, with bread on the shelves that was honestly made and worth buying, and that the people who bought it would take home and put on their tables, and that would be part of their Tuesday, in the way that small good things become part of a life. That was the thing her grandmother had built at the market, one Saturday at a time, for 30 years. That was the thing she had driven herself, over 9 months of early mornings and careful attention and patient work, to rebuild here. It was not grand. It was not spectacular. It would not make headlines beyond the regional magazine article that had already been written, but it was real, and it worked, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be, and it was here, and it was going to keep being here. She went back to work. At 11 o'clock, Lucy cut the cake. It was a plain Victoria sponge, made from a recipe Lucy said her mother had used since she could remember, and it was good, proper and simple, and made with the kind of care that meant you had thought about what you were making while you were making it. They ate it standing in the kitchen, the 5 of them, between the morning rush and the lunch preparation, and Naomi said that it was very good, and asked Lucy what the recipe was, and Lucy said she would write it out, and Naomi said thank you. None of them made speeches. They went back to work. The kitchen renovation took 3 weeks, and it happened in March, in the quiet period between the end of the winter range and the beginning of the spring one, chosen for exactly that reason. She had planned it with the same care she brought to everything: a week of meetings with a building contractor, a surveyor, and the estate maintenance team, during which she went through the kitchen space in detail and identified what could be changed and what would be changed and in what order. The work would be disruptive. The bakery would need to operate with reduced capacity for the first week, then with equipment temporarily relocated for the second week, then with everything being connected and calibrated in the third. She had planned for this by increasing the production in the 2 weeks before the renovation started, building a reserve of certain items that would freeze well, and communicating clearly to the regular customers what was happening and when the full range would return. This communication went up in the window, on a handwritten card, as always, signed with the bakery name. Several people mentioned it at the counter in the week before the work started. George said, "Will there be sourdough during the work?" "Reduced quantities," Margaret said. "But yes." He nodded. "Good," he said, and left. The renovation itself went broadly as planned, with the specific and practical chaos that all such work produced. Days when the contractors needed to be in a space before the bakers had finished in that space. Days when a particular fitting took longer than expected and altered the sequence of everything following it. Days when the dust that such work produced had to be managed so carefully that it slowed the baking by a degree that mattered. She managed through all of this with Frederick's support and the team's adaptability, and Colin in particular showed a capacity for thinking around problems in a physical space that she had not known he had. A spatial intelligence, the ability to see how things could be rearranged in a temporarily disrupted kitchen so that the essential work could continue. At the end of the third week, the new oven was installed and calibrated. The storage was reorganized. The sink arrangement had been improved to the point where 2 people could work at it simultaneously, without difficulty. The proving area had been extended by 8 square feet, which was not a large number but which, in a kitchen of that size, was the difference between the proving trays fitting as they needed to and constantly being moved to accommodate other work. The first morning after the renovation was complete, she arrived at 5 and turned on the new oven and felt the way it came to temperature. Even, steady, without the fluctuation she had been compensating for since her first week. She stood with her hand held near it for a long time, just feeling the consistency of it. Colin came in at 4:52 and did the same thing, standing near the oven with his hand out. "Different," he said. "Yes," she said. "Better?" "Significantly better," she said. He nodded. Then he washed his hands and began. The spring range that followed the renovation was the most ambitious range the bakery had ever offered under her management. She had planned 14 items, not all of them new, but some of them new, and all of them adjusted to take advantage of what the renovated kitchen could now do. A lighter crumb became possible when the oven temperature was truly consistent. A more precise timing on the sourdough's final prove became possible when the kitchen's temperature was more stable. Small improvements, but real ones, that showed up in the bread as a quality that was difficult to name, but that people felt when they tasted it. Claire Dawson came back in April. She did not come unannounced this time. She called ahead and asked if she could do a more thorough piece than the first one, now that the bakery was 9 months into the recovery and there was more to write about. Margaret thought about it for a day, then she said yes, with 2 conditions: that the piece focused on the team as much as on her, because the team was the story, and that she'd be allowed to read it before publication. Claire said yes to both. The piece ran in May. It was longer than the first one, a full feature, not just a column, with photographs taken by a photographer who came with Claire for an afternoon and who had the gift of finding the light in a working kitchen. The late afternoon light that came through the small window above the sink and caught the steam from a tray coming out of the oven. The light on the cooling rack where the morning sourdoughs were resting. There was a photograph of Patricia's notebook open on the counter. There was a photograph of Colin's hands in dough. There was a photograph of the queue at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And there was a photograph of the sign on the door, the old sign, the simple sign, the right sign, in the early light of a spring morning before the bakery had opened. The piece was read more widely than the first one. It was shared online in the way of pieces about food and community and the particular pleasure of small things done well. It was mentioned on 3 different food websites and in a newsletter that covered regional hospitality businesses. The effect on the bakery was an increase in visitors from outside the immediate area, people who drove to Heathbrook specifically to try the bakery, who sometimes looked slightly lost when they arrived and were reassured when they found the bakery where it had always been, modest and unassuming, and precisely what the article had described. She managed this increase by holding the standard absolutely firm and by not changing anything about how the bakery operated to accommodate the new attention. She did not add a sign explaining the story of the bakery. She did not add more tables. She did not put a note in the window saying, "as featured in." The bakery was what it was. It did not need to announce itself. People who came and ate the bread would understand what it was. People came and ate the bread and understood what it was. George came in one morning in late May, a Wednesday, not his usual day, and sat at the table by the window with a spiced fruit loaf and a cup of tea from the flask he always carried, and ate the loaf in the manner of someone eating something they had decided to give their full attention to. She was at the counter and could see him from where she stood, and she watched him without making it obvious that she was watching. When he finished, he came to the counter to return the plate she had brought with his loaf. He said, "That is the one." She looked at him. "The spiced fruit loaf," he said. "That is the one my wife used to buy here. Not similar, not close. That is it." She held his gaze. "I am glad," she said. He nodded. He picked up his flask and walked to the door. Then he stopped, which was his pattern. She would have liked to know the bakery came back, he said, not turning around. She thought it was gone. He went out. Margaret stood at the counter for a moment. Then she went through to the kitchen and found something to do that needed doing. The award letter came in June. It came addressed to the manager, Heathbrook Bakery, which she thought was the right address. It was from a regional food and culture organization that gave awards each year to businesses that had made an outstanding contribution to community and local food culture. The Heathbrook Bakery had been nominated, the letter said, by multiple members of the community. It did not specify who, and the awards panel had visited the bakery in April, when she had not known they were there, which she appreciated. They had eaten bread and watched the morning's operation and spoken to two of the team members, whose names were not specified in the letter. The award was being presented at a ceremony in the county town in late June, and they hoped that she and the team would attend. She put the letter on the desk and sat looking at it for a moment. Then she went to find Patricia. She found her in the front room, rearranging the display in the morning quiet before opening. She handed Patricia the letter. Patricia read it. She read it a second time. She set it down on the counter. "Well," she said. "Yes," Margaret said. "When is the ceremony?" "Late June." Patricia picked the letter up again and read a particular line, the one that said the award was for outstanding contribution to community and local food culture, and she read it with a look on her face that was something Margaret had not seen on her before. It was not quite joy. It was something that sat beneath joy, something more fundamental. It was the look of a person who has done something for a long time without being sure anyone noticed and has just found out that they were noticed. 9 years, Patricia said. She said it quietly, not to Margaret, more to the letter, or to herself. 9 years, Margaret said, and more. They went to the ceremony. All 5 of them. Margaret, Colin, Patricia, Lucy, Naomi. Patricia wore a jacket that Margaret had not seen before, formal and good. Colin was in a shirt with a collar, which altered his appearance in a way that was slightly startling. Lucy and Naomi sat together and looked, for the first 2 minutes, slightly nervous, and then did not. The award was presented by a woman from the regional council, who said several gracious things about the bakery's contribution to the community, and about the importance of small food businesses to the fabric of village life. Margaret accepted the award on behalf of the team and said, at the microphone, very briefly, "The people who made this possible are the people who stood up with me this evening. Everything I am going to say about what happened at the Heathbrook Bakery, they already know, because they were there every day. Thank you." That was all she said. Colin, when they were back in their seats, said, "Good speech." "Thank you," she said. The plaque went on the wall of the bakery the following morning, beside the door, at a height where someone entering would see it naturally, and without having to look for it. Below it, Naomi pinned the photograph that Lucy had printed from her phone, the one taken at the ceremony, the 5 of them outside the building in the late afternoon light, not posed, not looking at the camera, caught in a moment of actually talking to each other. The photograph showed them as they were. There was nothing performative about it. They were 5 people who had worked together in a kitchen for months and had made something that was worth recognizing, and they were talking about something specific and ordinary while someone took their picture, and it looked like exactly what it was. The summer came, and the bakery was full of it. The different light of summer mornings, the way the lanes smelled of warmth and cut grass from the fields beyond the village. The summer customers who were different from the winter customers, but who came back each year now, because the Heathbrook Bakery was the kind of place people came back to. Margaret arrived at 5 o'clock every morning, as she had since the beginning. She unlocked the door and pushed it open, and was met by the smell of the kitchen, cool and still, before the ovens changed it. And she put on the apron, and turned on the ovens, and began. She thought about Dorothy sometimes, in these early mornings, when the kitchen was quiet, and the light was not yet fully there, and the sound was only the ovens beginning their work. She thought about the recipe book, which she still had, still read, though less from necessity now than from love. The love of a person reading the handwriting of someone they miss, and finding them still present in it. She thought about the first morning, the flour on the floor, Colin's flat eyes, the cold kitchen, the number in the ledger that was going the wrong way, and had been going the wrong way for 2 years. She thought about what it had taken to get from that morning to this one. Not only the work, which had been considerable, not only the decisions, which had been many, not only the stubbornness, which she would acknowledge was real and was necessary, and which had been the thing that kept her going on the days when the going was difficult. What had it taken, beyond those things? She had thought about this question over many mornings, and she had arrived, over time, at a simple answer. It had taken the willingness to start from what was actually there, and not from what she wished was there. To see Colin as the person who could become the baker he became, not as the person who had spilled the flour and could not be bothered to sweep it up. To see Patricia as the woman who had 9 years of knowledge in her hands, and her memory, and needed only to be asked for it. To see the village as a community that had not stopped wanting a good bakery, it had only stopped having one. To see the bakery itself not as a failing business to be rescued, but as a place that had lost its reason to be, and needed only to be reminded of it. That was the thing. Seeing what was actually there, and believing that what was actually there was enough to work with. Dorothy had taught her that. She had taught it in the form of bread. The bread does not lie. You cannot fight it. You have to work with what it wants to do. But the lesson was not really about bread. It was about everything. About the way you looked at things. About the choice to see what was present and real, rather than what was absent or disappointing. She had made that choice in a cold kitchen on a Monday morning in September, with flour on the floor, and a young man who had given up, and everything that had happened since had grown from that choice. The ovens reached temperature. The morning light came through the window above the sink, the particular summer light that was already warm at 5 o'clock, and it lay on the counter, and the proving trays, and the clean surfaces of the kitchen. Colin came in at 4:47. He washed his hands. He looked at the ovens. He began. They worked in the easy silence of two people who had shared thousands of mornings in the same kitchen, who knew each other's pace and rhythm, and who no longer needed to communicate the ordinary things, because the ordinary things had become simply how they moved. At some point before 6, without looking up from the dough he was working, Colin said, "There is a second year." She had signed the contract 3 weeks ago. A second year, then a third. Full management, full authority. The building refurbished, and the equipment sound, and the team in place, and the village, knowing the bakery was here, and was going to stay here. "Yes," she said. He pressed the dough, he turned it, he pressed it again. "Good," he said. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor as the sun came up, warming the stone, the flour on the counter, the air above the proving trays where the dough was beginning its work. The Heathbrook Bakery was open. It had been open, without interruption, every weekday morning at 5 o'clock for 9 months. It would be open tomorrow. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.